I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 601, The Poor Man and the Great Victory. There were still 40 minutes until the constitutional vote of the Polish Great Sejm. Bishop Ignacy Masarski, another key member of the future Targowica Confederation, saw from the car window that the street in the distance was blocked by dozens of cavalrymen and was checking the passing carriages one by one. He had a bad premonition in his heart and immediately asked the driver to go around the alley next to him. Not long after, he changed into servant's clothes, put on a felt hat, and walked towards the Parliament all alone, while letting the carriage go around in Warsaw. Sure enough, he saw his political allies Count Brunicky, Archbishop Gorzakowski and others were stopped by soldiers along the way. However, he successfully got to the vicinity of the Parliament Hall with his inconspicuous clothes. Seeing the parliamentarians passing by the door of the Parliament Hall, he immediately felt confident. He took off his hat and strode towards the Parliament, muttering, "Damn Poniatowski, he actually wanted to stop me in this way. This stupid constitution will never pass." He didn't believe that Prince Poniatowski dared to let the soldiers entangle him here in front of the parliamentarians. Suddenly, a young noble in the crowd on both sides pointed at him and shouted, "Isn't this the Archbishop who is loyal to the Russians?" Someone next to him immediately shouted, "Yes, it's him." Why can such a person participate in the Great Sejm? He should vote in front of the Tsar, not in Poland. The speech delivered by Stanislaw II in the Winter Palace had long been transmitted back to Poland through Russian newspapers. People were all indignant at the extent of his flattery, which caused the king's reputation to be ruined. The Polish nobles who were loyal to Russia, mentioned in the speech, had a tenfold worse reputation. People would always subconsciously forgive the king and think that it was these nobles who had deceived the king and made him kowtow to Russia. Two young men bravely stood in front of Bishop Masarski and asked him why he wanted to be a slave to the Russians. The latter shouted at him, but attracted more people to surround him. Soon, the bell for voting came from the Great Sejm. Bishop Masarski was only 50 meters away from the Parliament Hall, but was blocked by the high wall formed by the people, and seemed to be far away from the horizon. In this way, more than 70% of the pro-Russian parliamentarians and most of the leaders of the extreme conservatives failed to participate in the vote. The king's party, liberals, centrists, and conservatives had reached a compromise long ago. At 3 p.m., the Great Sejm finally announced that Poland's new constitution was successfully passed with 268 votes in favor and 31 votes against. Thousands of citizens around were suddenly excited, jumping wildly, hugging each other tightly, and bursting into thunderous cheers. Long live the new constitution! Long live Poland! Thank God, it really passed. This is a victory for the Sejm, a victory for freedom. King Stanislaw II did not show up much during the vote, and only then hurriedly signed the constitution and swore to Archbishop Felix Turski that he would always be loyal to the constitution. After that, he left the Sejm very low-key and rushed to St. Petersburg almost without delay. When the people saw the king's motorcade, they all showed disdain and whispered, "This poor guy who only knows how to please the Russians. Ha! He got the throne by fucking a Russian woman." Fortunately, Prince Poniatowski is in charge of the government, otherwise Poland would have fallen into the hands of the Tsar long ago. That's right, without the promotion of His Royal Highness, our constitution would not have been born. Long live His Royal Highness. I heard that His Royal Highness is recruiting troops. Who will sign up with me? I'll go too. As the crowd began to flock to the Tyndome Square to celebrate, Count Brunicky, Bishop Masarski and others finally regained their freedom. However, the vote was over and nothing could be changed. If they wanted to overturn the constitution, they had to get the support of more than 2/3 of the members of the Great Sejm, that is, 260 members. This was obviously impossible. These people cursed Prince Poniatowski and the untouchables who dared to surround them, and at the same time, they all rushed to Count Stanislaw Potocki's house. That night, the Polish ultra-conservative nobles headed by Count Potocki, gathered together, all shouting with anger on their faces, "The king and his lackeys deceived us, and the whole of Poland. Today's vote is invalid. Yes, we can never accept such a result. We must try to reverse the current situation." Standing in the middle of the crowd, Count Potocki waved his hand and shouted, "All Poles should not be blinded by the Prussians and those royalist gangs. It is certain that only Russia can save our motherland." In order to balance their pro-Russian color, the ultra-conservatives slandered the Patriotic Party and the Royalist Party as being controlled by Prussia. It just so happened that Poland was currently in an alliance with Prussia. Interestingly, in the eyes of the Patriotic Party and the small nobles, the king stood on the side of the pro-Russian forces until late at night. Count Potocki announced that he would summon all the conservative nobles in Poland to hold a secret meeting in the town of Targowica in half a month to discuss the future of Poland. However, what Potocki and others did not know was that after Prince Poniatowski received Joseph's reminder, he instructed the Freedom and Security Committee to closely monitor these extreme conservatives. At this time, there were 2 servants in Count Potocki's house, and there were 5 others outside the house. They had heard the conspiracy clearly. Slavonia, a southern province of Austria. More than 2,000 Serbian rebels and hundreds of Bulgarian troops finally advanced to the defense line of the Austrian and Polish coalition forces after suffering 300 to 400 casualties under intensive shooting. The Serbian commander who saw all this in the telescope was overjoyed. His brave soldiers only needed one charge to make the cowardly Austrians flee in all directions. This was the experience he had summed up from more than 10 battles with the Austrian army. However, just as he was looking forward to a great victory, a group of red and white cavalry suddenly emerged from behind the hills on the east side. To be precise, those people were dressed in bright red uniforms with 2 towering white wings behind them. With a low trumpet sound, the cavalry quickly formed a team and rushed towards the right wing of the Serbian army. The rebel commander hurriedly ordered his cavalry to reinforce, but it was obvious that his poorly trained cavalry was intimidated by the overwhelming momentum of the red-winged angel in front of them, and it took a long time before they timidly rushed to the infantry flank. Chapter 602 Different Battlefields. When the Polish Command Lieutenant General Kosciuszko saw the enemy cavalry move, he immediately ordered the officer beside him to let his 4 cavalry squadrons be ready for reinforcement at any time. The winged hussars are the symbol of the Polish army, and they must ensure victory in every battle, at least before the decisive battle with the Russians. Therefore, Kosciuszko would wait until the situation was clear, and he was sure of winning before sending the newly formed winged hussars to the battlefield, allowing them to establish prestige by ending the enemy. Of course, the winged hussars themselves were elites selected from thousands of cavalrymen with the highest equipment level and salary in the Polish army, and their morale was also amazingly high. As soon as the Serbian cavalry and the winged hussars came into contact, they were rushed to pieces. The commander of the winged hussars, Anthony Madarinsky, immediately separated a squadron to pursue the enemy cavalry, and the other soldiers circled north, reorganized, and then waved their red-handled sabers and attacked the Serbian infantry. An hour and a half later, Kosciuszko looked at the enemy troops that had escaped from his sight and ordered to stop the pursuit. The order given to him by Prince Poniatowski was to train the army in actual combat as much as possible. He judged that at least nearly 1,000 Serbs were captured and killed in the battle just now. If he continued to chase them, he might catch them all in one fell swoop, and then there would be no chance for actual combat afterwards. He suppressed his guilt and turned to the Austrian commander beside him and said, "Our reconnaissance on the north bank of the Sava River is not detailed enough. In-depth pursuit is likely to fall into the enemy's ambush." The latter was accustomed to his cautious command style and immediately praised him, but didn't say anything else. On the other side, the winged hussars, who were escorting more than 300 Serbian prisoners, returned to the camp arrogantly, and the feathers behind them shone in the sunset. The surrounding Polish soldiers all cast envious and respectful eyes on them. Not to mention the record of the winged hussars. Their cool appearance alone is enough to make all the soldiers drool. The pair of wings behind them are made of thin steel bars sandwiched with ostrich feathers, weighing only 11 pounds. They are all custom made from French fashion companies, and the price is as high as 50 francs. Well, The Lion Textile Industry Association provided a loan, otherwise the poor Poland really couldn't afford these wings. The effect of actual combat training is also very significant point. These recruits who just came from Poland had only completed the most basic Q and shooting training before, but after fighting with real swords and guns on the battlefield for a few months, they have obviously gotten rid of the rawness of the recruits, not to mention how high their combat effectiveness is. At least they will not be so scared that they forget to reload ammunition when someone dies next to them, which is almost equivalent to the results of 2 years of training in the barracks. Petersburg Point, Winter Palace Point. When Platon Zubov saw the old face of Stanislaus II appear at the door, his mood immediately became as bad as walking in the muddy ground in late autumn for a day. Catherine II also seemed a little surprised. She looked at Stanislaus II, who bowed and said, "I thought you would be busy for a long time when you go back to preside over legislation." "Oh, you know, it was supposed to take a long time." The old man looked back at the Tsar sincerely, but the longing in my heart made me unable to do anything at ease, so I signed the paper and rushed back immediately. Catherine II glanced at the young man beside her, seemed to feel a little embarrassed, and waved her hand to signal him to go down first. Then he said to old Bacon, "Stasi, maybe you should seriously ask about the Polish constitution. As far as I know, this law has caused many upright nobles to be treated unfairly." "Oh, your majesty, can we talk about the constitution later?" Old Bacon said, motioning to the attendant at the door to bring his guitar, and said impatiently, "I composed this song when I was missing you on my way back to Warsaw this time, and I must play it for you immediately." "Oh, I named it Amours Interdits." Catherine II smiled kindly and nodded. "I'm looking forward to it too." The sound of the guitar rang out, slowly spreading in the house, as if gently caressing the softest part of the Tsar's heart, making her instantly intoxicated. This song is almost synonymous with guitar in later generations. Its Chinese name is the Romance of Love, which is soft and graceful, like a lover whispering in the ear about the plain and sweet past. After Stanislaus II got this song from the French crown prince, he was ready to use it as a trump card. And today is the time to use it. He knew very well that the new constitution would eliminate a lot of Poland's accumulated problems, which would make Poland revitalize and even usher in a new prosperity. At the same time, the constitution inevitably touched upon the interests of the great nobles and Russian forces. If the interests of these vampires were not taken back, Poland would only be forever weakened. Therefore, although Russia said on the surface that it would not interfere with Polish legislation, it had actually been secretly instructing the pro-Russian forces in Poland to obstruct the emergence of the constitution. This is also the reason why the Polish constitution has been prepared for more than 10 years and has only been born with difficulty. Once the Polish constitution is passed, it will inevitably anger Russia. What Joseph did not tell him was that in history, it was only 1 year after the May 3rd constitution was passed in the Great Sejm that Russia brazenly sent troops to invade Poland. At present, although Joseph asked the Poles to reduce the radical clauses in the constitution as much as possible and kept a close eye on the Targowica Confederation, which served as a guide for Russia during the Second Melon War, the risk of Russia sending troops is still very high. Soon, the song ended, and Catherine II savored it for 5 or 6 minutes before opening her eyes and gently applauding the old Bacon. "You are no less talented than those geniuses in Vienna. I want to listen to it again. This is for you. You can listen to it as many times as you want." Stanislaus II immediately set up the guitar again. Then he played "My Heart Will Go On" and other songs, and then, as usual, he and the Tsar began to recall the sweet time. It was not until dusk that the latter ended this special date tiredly and satisfied, and seemed in a good mood. Stanislaus II put away his musical instrument and was about to leave when he heard Catherine II say, "There is still some time before dinner. Why don't you tell me about the Polish constitution? Didn't you just come back from Warsaw?" The Polish king paused and thought to himself that what was coming would eventually come. He turned around and smiled. "Your Majesty, there is really nothing to say. You know, Poland is too poor." The ministers discussed for a long time and believed that they needed to give those people some security and hope so that they would work harder to make money and pay taxes. Oh, this can also contribute to the prosperity of Russia. Chapter 603 The Light of Hope. Stanislaw II said with great humility, Your Majesty, Poland will always be under your protection. All countries know that any improvement in Poland is inseparable from your gift. Is that so? Catherine II shook her head slightly. I heard that you are constantly instilling in the people the idea that they are Polish, whether they speak Polish, Russian or German. Cold sweat broke out on the Polish king's back. He knew that, if he said one wrong word at this time, Poland would fall into hell point. But the smile on his face became even brighter. Your Majesty, this is all a trick to coax those Prussians and Romanians who are unwilling to pay taxes. You have to make them feel that they are Poles before they will pay taxes to the King of Poland. Right. The proportion of the main ethnic groups in Poland, namely Poles and Lithuanians, is not high. There are a large number of Prussians, Russians, Austrians, and Romanians in the territory. This is also one of the important reasons why it is difficult for them to form a joint force to defend themselves against an invasion by a foreign enemy. Stanislaw II continued. Those stupid officials in Warsaw somehow managed to spread this "deception" to Ukraine. There is no need for this at all. Oh, if this makes you uncomfortable, I'm ordering them to stop promoting it like this now. After more than 2 years of dissemination, Poland's nationalist ideas have already been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people, and there is no need for the government to promote them. Later, he would ask the parliament to issue a ban on promoting the idea of Greater Poland nation. However, ideological trends cannot be prohibited by government decrees at all. They may even trigger people's rebellious psychology and set off another wave of upsurge. However, Russia has no excuse to embarrass the Polish government. You see, I have tried very hard, but these untouchables are disobedient, and there is nothing I can do. Catherine II narrowed her eyes, as if accepting Stas's explanation, and then asked, so is Warsaw's massive military expansion in recent months also to scare untouchables who are unwilling to pay taxes? Stanislaw II only felt that his scalp was tight. To be honest, if his nephew and Mr. Sias had not made sufficient plans for him before departure, he would definitely be so nervous that he could not speak. Fortunately, the Tsar's problems were not unexpected. Your Majesty, this is just to make some money, he said pitifully. You know, Poland's debt problem is already extremely serious. I think more troops will only consume more finances to maintain. The Tsar's voice was a little cold. Tell me who you want to deal with so many troops. Stanislaw II tried to keep himself calm and pretended to be aggrieved. Your Majesty, these armies are really just a business. In order to make some money for the state treasury, Mavakovsky thought of what the Bulgarians did, which was to organize useless untouchables into mercenaries. It happened that Austria said they needed to deal with the rebellion in Slavonia, so I asked him to recruit some people to earn commissions. Don't worry, I will disband these troops as soon as I finish the Austrian business. Actually I don't have the money to feed so many soldiers. Of course, this is just to delay time. As long as Russia does not object for the time being, when these recruits mature, there will be no fear of Russia having any objections again. Okay. Catherine II finally smiled again. Stasi, I must remind you that only Russia sincerely protects Poland and hopes that Poland will become stronger. Leaving Russia will make Poland is in danger. Stanislaw II hurriedly bowed and said, yes, Your Majesty, please believe this is what I think too. At noon the next day, Catherine II received Potemkin's letter. The letter advised her not to trust Stanislaw II. After the adoption of the new constitution, Poland is gradually moving away from Russia and getting closer to a sovereign state. Russia should continue to prepare for war against Poland and not relax. Although Potemkin was a Nazi, he received a tip from Zubov, his love rival, and learned that the Polish king was trying to influence the Tsar. So, he wrote this letter immediately. Catherine II hesitated for a moment and threw the letter into the drawer. In fact, there was no need for Potemkin to remind her. As one of the most capable monarchs in Europe, she had naturally seen that Stanislaw II had ulterior motives in flattering her, but she rarely hesitated. although all signs in Poland showed that they were preparing something. Stasi also assured her that these would be corrected. She didn't know why, but she suddenly remembered his melancholy and vicissitudes of life, and instantly felt that she should believe him once. Poland would still be the docile and obedient protectorate it was before. Southern Netherlands city of Ostend. Edmund Henry Denville looked at the dozen or so sailing ships in the sunset and felt a sense of unreality in his heart. In the past 20 years, he never thought that he would one day become a sailor, just as he never thought that one day he would be able to pay off that terrible debt. Old Denville tortured him for 16 years, and the only inheritance left to him was a debt of 5,300 livres. The old drunkard's life consisted only of bad alcohol and drunkenness. 6 years ago, when he was drunk, he accidentally killed a nobleman. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison and compensated the other man's family 3,000 livres. He was lucky enough to die before going to prison. In order to pay off the debt, Denville's mother sold off her property and borrowed from all relatives and friends who could borrow, and finally paid off the 3,000 livres. Then she was exhausted. After so many years, the interest of 3,000 yuan has become more than 5,000 yuan after the interest is doubled. When the debt-ridden Denville was desperate, Maderno, a distant relative and one of his biggest creditors, introduced him to a very lucrative job. You can earn 1,200 francs a year. He can pay off his debt in less than 5 years. That is to follow the Poor's gang, to run maritime business. At that time, Denville was still very disappointed because he had never been on a ship in his life, let alone a sailor. However, Maderno told him that the Walloon Business Council had recently opened a new marine business school where one could learn how to become a seafarer. The tuition is only 30 francs, and you can study first and pay the tuition later. Therefore, after receiving 4 months of surprise training, Denville successfully passed the trainee handyman assessment and then got a job on the Leisure. The boatswain of the Leisure promised him an annual salary of 1,350 francs as long as he promised to go to sea with the ship 6 times a year. Chapter 604. The rapid development of British-French trade. 7 or 8 carriages slowly arrived at the dock. On the Leisure, several people jumped out immediately. They shouted loudly and asked the crew to load the contents of the car onto the ship. Denville and dozens of sailors rushed forward, unloaded boxes of goods from the carriages, and carried them onto the ship. Denville weighed the 2 wooden boxes on his shoulders. They were not heavy. He looked at his distant relative Maderno beside him. The latter was an old sailor and served as the second-class sailor on the Leisure, and asked in a low voice, "What is in this? It won't bring us anything. Danger of the gallows." No matter how stupid he is, he can still think of paying so much wages, loading goods near dark, and not going to those big ports. This is definitely not a serious business. It's silk. Maderno said with a relaxed expression. You can earn 300 francs by shipping the 2 boxes in your hand to England. This business is not dangerous. I have gone to sea 4 times with the ship, and everything went well. Silk. Denville looked at the carriages. Are they all covered with this stuff? That's about right. There are also some high-end wines. Got, how much is that worth? I don't know. It must be at least 60,000 francs. It seems our boss is very rich. That's not necessarily the case. Maderno pretended to smile mysteriously. I heard that, as long as you can hook up with the Pulse gang, you can get goods from France on credit, and you only need to pay a small deposit. As he spoke, he gestured towards the Leisure with his chin. Even this ship was borrowed from the Pulse gang. It is said that, as long as you make 12 successful business trips, you can buy it at a very low price. This ship, really? Denville's eyes widened. Is the Purse gang so powerful? Of course it's true. Maderno whispered. There are big names behind the Purse gang. Let me tell you, when I save enough money, I also plan to borrow a ship and run some business on credit. By then, you will be my boatswain. Oh, if you are qualified. Denville's eyes flashed with joy, and then he said nervously, after talking for a long time, what kind of business is this? Anyway, we are going to sea tomorrow, so it doesn't matter if I tell you. This ship will smuggle these silks, wines, and cosmetics to the UK. Well, it's the kind that doesn't pay customs duties. You mean smuggling? Don't be so serious. We call this private transactions. If you take these things to the UK, you can easily earn 30% profit, but if you get caught, don't worry, you won't be caught. Percy's helper is very knowledgeable, Moderno said, patting him on the shoulder, and even if the worst happens, your sister will still get 4,000 francs in insurance money. Someone will work to rescue you later. Throughout the night, the carriages from Bruges kept coming, loading carts of goods onto several ships, parked next to the simple dock point during the day. All activities were suspended until dusk fell again. The Leisure and the two schooners next to it raised half sail and began to slowly leave the shore point. The three ships were about 2 nautical miles apart, heading northwest, and arrived near Norfolk, England. A few hours later. The sea conditions in the English Channel are very good, and with year-round trade exchanges, the pilot has long memorized the waterway, and as long as there is a little light, he will not deviate. Yeltsin took the lead in furling its sails and stopped. After waiting for about an hour, they saw a few bright lights flashing on the sea in the distance. Point Moderno and the third mate rowed the famous dinghy towards the light spot. After a while, they returned, and the third mate handed a note to the captain. The captain immediately issued an order, sail due west and set sail in 25 minutes. Lower the sails 10 nautical miles from the coast at 4:20. Maintain strict light control. Denville grabbed the distant relative who was passing by and asked in a low voice, "What did you do just now?" "Get the pass." Moderno winked proudly. "There are British anti-smuggling ships everywhere around here. If you don't pay attention, you will be hit." So, the Puas gang arranged for serious merchant ships to constantly observe their movements nearby and find a route that can avoid them all. Denville opened his mouth in surprise. Little did he know that the powerful Puas gang was actually one of the several vests of the Special Trade Association. These vests include gangs, smuggling organizations, and even chambers of commerce. They recruit a large number of smuggling ships in the southern Netherlands and northern France. The Industrial Development Fund provides them with supplies, and the French intelligence agency provides cover. In recent months, the scale of special trade has expanded 12 times, with an average monthly trade volume of 5 million francs, and it continues to surge. At the same time, thanks to strict organization and unified management, no smuggling ship has been caught by the British anti-smuggling fleet. So far, this is the power of state behavior. As expected, the Leisure easily avoided all British anti-smuggling ships and successfully docked on a deserted beach in Norfolk. In fact, it cannot be considered a deserted beach. A simple pier was built here with wooden planks, and a broken road passed through the grass and shrubs, leading directly to a church 8 miles away. After receiving monthly benefits of £5 to £20, all the priests in the church will even help move goods together during busy times. The church's cellar has been expanded more than 10 times and is used for temporary storage of goods on the simple dock. Hundreds of workers quickly unloaded the goods on the ship and then loaded them onto trucks to transport them to the chapel. Every Monday and Thursday, British caravans would transport a large number of goods from farmhouses near the church and then sell them in markets in Norfolk, Essex and even London. You should know that the current British excise tax is a core tax point from the birth and baptism of children to marriage and housing. Various supplies, including windows, saddles, cosmetics, dried fruits, oil, etc., are subject to tax. As for tobacco, alcohol, tea, sugar and the like, the tax rate is even higher. Therefore, when these duty-free goods shipped from the southern Netherlands entered the British market, all goods from legitimate channels were immediately beaten without any resistance. Smuggled goods are almost always sold at 80% to 90% of the market price, and the quality is absolutely guaranteed. Even so, these goods can still make a 30% profit. It can be seen how high the consumption tax and tariffs in the UK are. Starting from Norfolk, legitimate shops have been bankrupted. However, savvy businessmen soon discovered the trick and switched to purchasing goods through special channels. During this period, the British people were very happy. Their daily expenses dropped significantly. British businessmen were also very happy, especially those who did not follow the usual path. They easily beat their competitors with their price advantage, and their sales soared. The only unhappy ones were the tax officials in several British cities. Their tax revenue in the past 3 months dropped by 35%. Chapter 605. Let's make a fortune together. Late at night, Denville was very lucky to be assigned the task of restocking, which meant that he could rest in the town's chapel tonight. Well, the Leisure cannot return empty after unloading its cargo. It will return loaded with wool, wood, leather and even tea purchased from Norfolk. Most of these items will be unloaded in Calais, France, while some will go directly to the port of Le Havre. However, the purse gang required them to declare customs and pay taxes in accordance with regulations in France. Although this will reduce the profit of the return journey to an extremely low level, every smuggling ship has a liaison officer from the purse gang watching over it, and the captains do not dare to mess around. The raw materials of these British specialties are purchased locally at a lower price than the official price sold to France, so the profits are barely acceptable to the captains. Anyway, the trip to England has already made a lot of money. Denville, who had been carrying dry oak boards for half the night, let out a long yawn and was about to take a nap. There might be another shipment coming after dawn, so he had to save some energy. Although the salary of this job is high, it is also very tiring. The pastor of the church thoughtfully sent blankets to the sailors on the ship. As a devout Catholic, Denville looked at the kindly smiling Protestant priest in front of him, hesitated for several seconds, and finally took the blanket. It was too cold to sleep on the church floor. Just when he dreamed that he had paid off his debts and had a smile on his face, he was kicked awake and a low roar came from his ears. Something happened. Get up, purse. Help Jax Barrow, the steward here. Wake everyone up. And then went to the second floor window to look out. Someone put a gun in Denville's hand. He carefully approached the window and saw 5 or 6 horses galloping towards the church under the morning sun, but they were obviously not here to deliver goods. Moderno also came to the second floor and said nervously, "Mr. Ballon, isn't he from the British anti-smuggling team?" "It's not clear yet." Ballon frowned and shook his head. The Special Trade Association has informants near the Norfolk anti-smuggling team and the police. If any unusual movement is detected, they will immediately come to the police. There hasn't been any mistakes in the past few months. A priest came to the door, talked to the visitor for a while, then returned to the second floor and said to Ballon, "It's not the anti-smuggling team or the police." The latter breathed a sigh of relief. "Then they are this. You'd better ask them yourself." Ballon inserted the pistol into his waist and came to the door of the church in confusion. He heard the well-maintained middle-aged man opposite, "Are you in charge here?" "I'm in charge here. Are you?" The middle-aged man smiled and said, "I know this church runs some special businesses." Ballon immediately moved his hands behind his back and said warily, "So, what do you want?" The middle-aged man made a gesture of pressing down with his hands. "Relax, friend. My boss said that your current business method is a bit, not efficient enough. He intends, if he can, to agent your goods to Norfolk and sell them in a more efficient manner." Ballon was stunned for a moment. "How did you find this place? And who is your boss?" "There are so many high quality bargains on the market, and those who are willing can always find their source. Please believe me, we can help you plug this loophole." The middle-aged man glanced around and then said, "As for my boss, you must have heard of him. Lord George Hoon, Parisian, the office of the Minister of Trade in the Palace of Versailles." Bay looked through the documents sent by the Special Trade Association with a smile on his face. "Lord George Hoon." He handed a report to Major Garrett, the head of the Trade Investigation Division of the Intelligence Bureau opposite the old Norfolk families and the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce, the mayor, the tax collector and many. We all have friendships with the congressman. He promised to sell our business through formal channels through the local Chamber of Commerce, doubling sales in a short period of time, and at the same time, provide protection at the police station. But he asked for 20% of the profit and the pricing power for the goods in Norfolk. The latter glanced at the report in his hand, then looked at the large pile of documents on Bay's desk, his expression full of emotion. The Intelligence Bureau had previously judged that finding partners in Britain and its colonies would be the biggest challenge. They planned to invest half of the manpower of the Trade Investigation Office and 300,000 francs in funding. Unexpectedly, without any effort on their part, a large number of British forces came to seek cooperation, and the asking price was much lower than their initial estimate. "I'm starting to like these British gentlemen," Bay handed over another report. This is Mr. David Havers from Hampshire. Well, it just so happens that his uncle is the deputy of the South Coast Anti-Smuggling Team commander, but he has a big appetite and wants to get the market from Plymouth to Portsmouth. Aha, you would never guess this. Baron Henry Graves also hopes to cooperate with us. Baron Graves? You mean assistant to the Governor General of Newfoundland? That's right. Bay smiled broadly. He even said that he could send a ship to pick up the goods on a small island in the Atlantic Ocean and then fly the British flag back to Canada. In this era, Canada was just a geographical concept, and the few British colonists were concentrated in the small area of the Great Lakes. Therefore, the name Newfoundland is often used to refer to the British colonies in North America, which shows the great influence of the Governor of Newfoundland. Is this a trap of the British? Major Garrett said cautiously. I think it is unlikely. Bay pointed to a few lines on the report. More than 60% of the first batch of goods we shipped to Canada were bought by him personally. That is 350,000 francs of wine and textiles. I will send someone to verify it there. In the past month, the Special Trade Association has harvested 7 heavyweight partners in Britain and its colonies, and with their help, it has built a complete transportation sales channel. There are even people like the Assistant Governor of Newfoundland who bring their own ships to invest. As for Portugal's Brazilian colony, the Creoles there have been constantly clamoring for independence and demanding free trade rights. So the cheap and easy to use French were immediately warmly welcomed. After arriving on the shore, José Xavier, the leader of the Brazilian independence movement, personally sent people to contact the smuggling fleet to help with sales, and also ordered a batch of military supplies such as tents and medicines in the Indian Peninsula. Mysore, an old friend of France, served as a distributor. As long as the smuggled goods arrived at the peninsula, the long border between Mysore and the various princely states was impossible to control. Chapter 606 Thunder exploded. For the French Minister of Trade, what he saw was that the export volume continued to soar at a rate of more than 10% per month. Although the French factories affected by the previous order scam had received subsidies and sold most of their inventory, they basically did not suffer any losses, but the extra workers they hired to complete the orders and the machines they purchased were still a headache. Recently, with the rise of smuggling trade with Britain and Portugal, most factories have put idle production capacity into operation, and there is even a slight shortage of supply. At the same time, with the increasing amount of goods shipped to the South Netherlands, the construction speed of the Wallonia region has also increased several times compared to before. As long as money flows, it will naturally be richer. In order to facilitate freight transportation, the smugglers even raised funds themselves to extend the wooden track originally planned by Joseph from Hennegor to Ostend to Luxembourg, and finally connected it with the wooden track in France at Verdun. Ostend has become extremely prosperous in a few months from a small seaport that no one cares about. A large number of residents in northern France, French-speaking people in the southern Netherlands, and even a large number of Italians have gathered here to earn high salaries for special trade. Because there are too many sailors looking for work. The wages have been reduced from 100 francs per month to 80 francs. But even so, this is an extremely tempting high salary. And these people always need food, clothing, housing and transportation, and their salaries must be spent somewhere. As a result, more masons, carpenters, shoemakers and even lost women followed. A large number of houses, shops, and entertainment venues have emerged around the port like mushrooms after rain. The population in the Ostend area has rapidly increased from more than 4,000 to more than 50,000 and is still rising. The Austrian government's control over the southern Netherlands was not very strong, and these tens of thousands of French-speaking people ignored the decrees of Brussels, while the influence of the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce gradually expanded to the northwest of the southern Netherlands. It can be said that, if Joseph had not considered that it would provoke Austria, he would have immediately incorporated all the areas south of Brussels into France. This was an unexpected gain that he had not expected before. Some were happy and some were sad. Just when Austin's maritime trade was in full swing, London was facing a terrible earthquake. In a cafe in Thames Harbour, Mesmer, dressed as a scholar, looked at the distant London city with some reluctance and sighed. I'm sure that Sir N. Fidgip has developed a strong interest in the prospects I have described. In 3 days, at most 3 days, he will invest £50,000 to buy corporate bonds. He looked at Colonna, who was tasting coffee. But you don't give me these 3 days. Colonna ignored him, and the general manager of Lightning Company, Sterler, who had 2 small mustaches on his side, whispered, the Baron Mordaunt has been questioned in Parliament, and there is really no way to delay it any longer, due to the successive extensions of the construction period of the London Gas Street Light project. Councillor Mordaunt, who pushed for this matter, was exploited by his political opponents and lost face. So, Mordaunt found the Mayor of London and ordered him to produce results enough to shut up the Parliament before the end of this year. The latter immediately agreed. He was very confident because 80% of the construction of London's gas street lamps had been completed and only needed to be tested for gas before they could be put into use. This ratio almost covered the entire city. I believe that when London lights up in the night, the gentlemen of the Parliament will definitely smile. Yes, Lightning Company told Mayor Herbert that the London Gas Street Lamp project was nearing completion, and the latter had no doubts at all. Now the streets and alleys in London are full of street lamps, with elegant shapes and solid bolts, all full of industrial beauty. However, what Herbert didn't know was that these street lamps were only beautiful. All street lamps were manufactured and installed by subcontractors strictly in accordance with Lightning Company's drawings. Not only were the pipe interfaces unable to be sealed, and there were no necessary valves, but even the materials of the gas pipes were very particular, ensuring that they would corrode within a year after being buried. Even if the British invested a large sum of money and hired someone to resume this unfinished project, they would have to dig out all the pipes by this time next year. The cost would be even higher than laying the pipes from scratch. After that, Herbert asked Lightning to put the built street lights into use. For the future of Councillor Mordaunt, he also directly issued an announcement to hold a grand ceremony to light up London's gas street lights at the end of the year. Of course, the street lights could not be lit at all. So after discussing, Colonna and Styler decided to run away. Moreover, they had really made enough money. Just a few hours after the ship that Colonna and others were on left the Thames Harbour, the Mayor of London, Baron Mordaunt, and a group of officials appeared at the ceremony. However, when Herbert heard his assistant whisper in his ear, he was a little angry. None of the general manager and senior executives of Lightning were present, and they could not be found anywhere. Herbert glanced at the thousands of people and a large group of reporters at the scene, and a bad feeling surged in his heart. But when he caught a glimpse of the technicians from the Lightning Company standing not far away, as well as the owners of the companies involved in the gas street lamp project, he felt relieved. As long as there are technicians who can light up the street lights, it will be fine. The rest will be settled with that. Still later the sun began to set, and after the congressman and the mayor gave wonderful speeches, the sky just got dark. Baron Mordaunt raised his hand excitedly and said, "Let us use light to dispel the darkness of London." Dozens of lamplighters immediately dispersed. Each opened the glass lampshade and inserted the thin and long burning rod at one end into the street light. Then they all showed surprise, began to check the valves, and then lit the lights again. The night was still as dark as before. The lamplighters quickly changed other street lights to try, but they still couldn't light up. After a full half an hour, news came from all over London that no lamp could be lit. Herbert glared at the Lightning Company technician, who explained with a bitter face, "Mayor, the gas should not be coming through. I have asked someone to check, however, the inspection did not produce any results." An hour later, Herbert announced with a gloomy face, "Due to a technical failure, the lighting ceremony has been postponed." The next morning, he led a group of officials to the Lightning Company to ask for punishment. Styler and others still did not show up. A technician reported to the mayor tremblingly, "I checked the main output pipeline, and there is indeed no gas there." "Then, go check your distillery," Styler said angrily. The technician lowered his head helplessly and said, "But, Mayor, only the chief technician can go in there." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 607 Retribution. After confirming that all the senior executives of Lightning Company were out of contact, the Mayor of London ordered people to force open the door of the distillation workshop. The lights were bright here, but there was no one in sight, leaving only the retort and other equipment with a metallic luster lying there. Make the move. Herbert turned and shouted at the technicians. The technicians looked at each other, but said that they didn't know how to operate this thing. At noon, two scholars from the Royal Academy of Sciences came to Lightning Company. After repeated confirmation and attempts to operate, the older one said to Herbert, "Unfortunately, Mr. Mayor, this thing seems to be just an empty iron can. It can't even burn for a long time." Another scholar pointed to the heating furnace. "It can only hold less than 50 pounds of coal, and it is absolutely impossible to distill gas to supply the whole of London." Herbert, who was unwilling to give up, asked the scholars to turn over the entire Lightning Company again, and finally confirmed that only the equipment in the basement could produce a small amount of gas. It was a phase project used to maintain dozens of street lights around the city hall. Besides, they couldn't even produce half a liter of gas. Herbert was stunned for several minutes before he finally realized that he had encountered a huge scam. No, the whole of London and even the whole of Britain were deceived. That night, the matter was reported directly to Little Pit. The young Prime Minister stared at the Home Secretary, the Duke of Portland, frowning. In other words, this Lightning Company also issued hundreds of thousands of pounds of bonds through the bank. The latter nodded. "The Commercial Credit Bank, founded by the Godmid family. I have sent people to verify the total amount of the bonds, and it is estimated to be at least £700,000. Little Pitt felt dizzy. £700,000. This figure will definitely cause an uproar in London. You know, the funding for the entire gas street lamp project is only £300,000. He hurriedly asked, "What is the relationship between the Commercial Credit Bank and the Lightning Company? Freeze all their accounts immediately." "Yes, Mr. Prime Minister, I have done so," the Duke of Portland said, "but there are only more than £20,000 in the bank account, and other assets are still being counted. As for their relationship, it seems that they are accomplices now. The funds used by the British to buy Lightning Company bonds have long been transferred, and the more than £20,000 are all the bank's own deposits." Little Peter slammed the table hard and asked subconsciously, "Is it too late to block the news? This is probably not easy. After all, there are too many people involved, and the street lights in London have not been lit." Little Peter raised his head and exhaled, and ordered, "You immediately count the bank and Lightning Company, and try to find as many assets as possible to reduce the impact of the incident. In addition, let Mordaunt resign as a member of Parliament immediately. As for Herbert, he is the direct person in charge, and he can only be used to calm the anger of the people." Until this point, he had only considered this as an ordinary fraud case. At most the amount involved was very large, so he was still considering how to reduce the impact and deal with the aftermath. In fact, compared to the hundreds of thousands of corporate bonds, the subcontracting companies involved in the London gas street light project were the most powerful bomb. After the Duke of Portland left, Little Pitt asked his entourage to summon the people of Lloyd's of London, the strongest private intelligence agency in the UK, and commissioned them to investigate the gas street light case. Bad news always spreads the fastest. It was only the 2nd at noon. Almost all Londoners knew that the gas street lights were just a scam. On the church bell tower, Sir Elvis stared into the distance with empty eyes. He spent all his wealth on the Lightning Company bonds. Yesterday, he was still bragging to others about his investment talent, and that he would definitely be successful in the future. As a result, he became a joke today. He remembered that he had been courteous to Baron Watson before, and even sent his sister to his bed, but it only made it easier for that guy to cheat him of his money. "You are simply the stupidest idiot in the world." He pointed at himself and shouted, "Idiots should not be alive." After saying that, he jumped off the clock tower. Reality seems cruel, but it is also fair. If Joseph had not discovered the order scam in time and managed to recover some of the losses, there would be countless bankrupt factory owners in France who would jump off like Elvis in the following days. The situation in London continued to deteriorate rapidly. First, dozens of subcontracting companies involved in the gas street lamp project asked the London City Hall for the project payment, and the latter naturally refused without hesitation. These subcontracting companies all signed agreements with Lightning Company. How could the London City government recognize this account? And the London City government did not so much money. That afternoon, two subcontracting companies declared bankruptcy. After all, it was a project involving hundreds of thousands of pounds. Some of the work that had been completed before, such as the cost of manufacturing street lights and laying pipes, were all paid by these companies. The amount was higher than the other, but they didn't get a penny back. The huge losses made them choose bankruptcy. Soon there was a wave of bankruptcies. In less than a month, nearly 20 subcontracting companies went bankrupt one after another. Then the shock wave of bankruptcy began to spread downward. Suppliers who sold raw materials and equipment to bankrupt companies also began to go bankrupt because they could not recover a large amount of money. Then a large number of workers employed by these companies lost their jobs. These people soon came to the London City Hall and joined the protest team of the subcontracting companies. The windows of the City Hall were all smashed, and the outer walls were covered with filth. The officials were so scared that they dared not come to work at all. Finally, Mayor Herbert saw that the protesting workers had set fire outside the City Hall, and he could no longer restrain himself and mobilized the police to disperse the crowd. The two sides inevitably clashed. Hundreds of demonstrators were arrested and imprisoned, and dozens of police officers were injured. And more serious problems have just begun to emerge. The cause was that the London City Hall wanted to repair the sewer pipes in a certain area, but found that there was no contractor who could do it. After Herbert asked someone to investigate, he found out that almost all the companies involved in the pipeline laying business in London had gone bankrupt. The gas street lamp project was so attractive at the time that all companies with a little strength tried their best to get involved. But they all died in it. In fact, it is not just the pipeline laying industry. Companies related to pipeline casting, valve manufacturing, gas lamp manufacturing, distillation equipment processing, and other industries have also been wiped out. It can be said that the foundation of the British gas street lamp industry has completely collapsed. Chapter 608 Aftermath. Southeast London. A black carriage stopped outside the King's private castle, Windsor Castle. Little Peter got out of the carriage with a stern expression, looked up at the grey-white castle in front of him, and couldn't help but take a deep breath. Now he must obtain the support of His Majesty the King, otherwise it will be difficult to survive this crisis. Yes, the London gas street lighting thing has turned into a serious political crisis. Little Peter initially thought he only lost hundreds of thousands of pounds. But he soon learned that a large number of companies in London had closed down. Thousands of workers were unemployed, and violent clashes broke out in the City Hall. Until then, he still didn't realize the seriousness of the matter. As a result, a run broke out last Thursday at London's Manor Investment Bank and Lloyds Bank. These two banks had provided huge loans to subcontractors for the gas street lighting project. And there is a high probability that the money will not be recovered. Londoners who received the news were worried that the two banks would go bankrupt, just like a large number of companies that had gone bankrupt recently, so they frantically rushed to the banks to withdraw money. After only 2 days, Manor Investment Bank couldn't stand it any longer and announced that it would temporarily suspend withdrawal operations. But this triggered even greater panic among depositors. It seemed that the bank was really out of money. The number of people who came to rush suddenly doubled several times. This is the leverage effect of finance. A bank with a capital of millions of pounds will go bankrupt due to bad debts of less than £100,000, causing the entire capital chain to break. Soon, the run began to spread to other banks. All banks that had financial dealings with the gas street light project became the target of public suspicion, and Little Pete finally couldn't sit still. Although the Whigs had not yet taken advantage of this incident to launch an attack, Peter knew very well that they were looking for an opportunity to deal a fatal blow to themselves. In fact, according to the current situation, banks will soon have widespread problems. By then, even if the opposition party does nothing, they will have to get out of number 10 Downing Street. Sir Stuart, dressed in black attire, came out of the castle to greet him. When little Pete saw his handsome face, he suddenly felt a lot more at ease. His Majesty the King is waiting for you. Sir Stuart bowed to his side and gestured, please follow me. After entering the gate of the castle and walking along the corridor, Sir Stuart took advantage of the entourage behind him not to notice, reached out and held little Pete's hand, squeezed it twice softly, and whispered, don't be nervous, I have already asked your Majesty. I mentioned this, and his reaction was quite calm. He has been paying attention to things in North America recently, but don't mention Ireland. Oh, His Majesty's condition is stable recently. You can chat with him for a while. Little Pete held his hand with his backhand, placed it on his forehead and rubbed it, and the feeling of peace of mind became even stronger. He raised his eyes to look at Sir Stuart, his eyes full of dependence and gratitude. The latter nodded slightly to him. Neither of them said anything more, but they both understood what the other meant. Yes, they are a secret couple. Little Peter was able to gain the respect of George III in the first place, and it was also inseparable from the strong support of Stuart as the King's secretary. Not long after, Stuart pushed open the door of the King's office and said into the room, Your Majesty, Mr. Pitt is here. Oh. Come in. A hoarse voice came from behind the table. Little Pete looked up and saw George III sitting on a chair, wearing a hospital gown made of white thick linen. His face was covered with stubble, and there were strangulation marks on his face and neck. He looked quite tired. It looked like it had just been treated. He hurriedly stepped forward and bowed. Your Majesty, King. George III waved his hand and motioned to the chair on the left. Sit down. Are you here about the London gas street lights? Yes, Your Majesty. So, what are your plans? Now, some banks have been affected, so it will be a bit tricky. Little Peter then told the story of the bank run. George III sighed. Therefore, there must be a fund to deal with depositors, and the first bankrupt bank must not appear. As long as the banks can hold on, within a month or two at most, people will regain confidence in the banks and the runs will stop. But if a bank fails, panic will spread quickly, increasing the number of runs, and who knows how many more banks will fail later. Yes, Your Majesty. Little Peter nodded. At least £700,000. Have you thought of a way? The King knew that the Prime Minister was not asking for money from him, because he didn't have much money either. Little Peter hesitated and said, Mr. Henry Hope is the Dutch banker. Vienna has issued a wanted order for him, and he is still in London. If we hand him over to His Majesty Leopold II, it will be a great boost to the relations between the two countries. George III touched the beard on his chin and said calmly, as for things that are beneficial to diplomacy, just go ahead and do it. But I remember that he previously spent a sum of money to implement his plan, and the remaining property was enough for £10,000. It should not be enough. But the Dutch investor who came with him, Vanquix, was also involved in that trade plan. We can treat him as an accomplice. George III nodded slightly. After you have the funds, how are you going to solve other problems? Last week we found the body of the owner of the Commercial Credit Bank. Little Pitt said he committed suicide and left a suicide note saying that he wanted to expand the bank's business through the gas street light project, but encountered technical difficulties which prevented the project from being delivered. After he exhausted the funds he raised, he was no longer able to maintain the project, so he chose to commit suicide. George III sneered. Oh, do you believe it? Little Pitt pondered for a moment, looked at the King and said, we should choose to believe it. If the British government agrees with the statement in the suicide note, then first of all, the mastermind behind the whole thing will be arrested first. Although he is dead, the public's emotions at least have an outlet. This is far better than letting the criminal go unpunished. In that case, someone will still bring up the case more than 10 years later. Secondly, the defrauded funds have also been settled. They were all used by Godmid on the street light project. Although the cost is inexplicably high, this gap does not need to be filled. Seeing the King nod, Little Pitt breathed a sigh of relief and continued, the government will prosecute London Mayor Herbert and officials involved in gas street lights. George 3 interrupted him and said, "No need to do this. Herbert was just deceived by the swindlers. Just like everyone in the world makes mistakes. Just remove him from office." Little Pete immediately understood the king's intention. The fact that the project was given to Lightning Company almost certainly meant that Herbert received bribes. If corruption is discovered later, the public will be even more angry about the gas street light project. Chapter 609 New Year, New Hope. After talking with George III for nearly 2 hours, Little Pete finally felt confident. The king still supported him. He saw the familiar figure of Dr. Willis appear at the door and said hurriedly, "Your Majesty, I will calm down the gas street lamp situation as soon as possible." However, Lord Fox, he was talking about James Fox, leader of the opposition Whig Party. Our focus is on the French strategy, and this requires a stable cabinet. On the Whig side, I will advise them not to cause trouble. Before George III finished speaking, Dr. Willis came over, leaned over and said, "Your Majesty, it's time for your treatment. There is also a leech and mustard healing treatment tonight, which will make your spirit more relaxed." George III suffers from porphyria, which causes brain problems from time to time, so he has been living in Windsor Castle for treatment recently. Treatment items include binding, scalding, whipping, sticks, bloodletting, poisonous insects, etc. Well, the King of England's physical fitness is indeed good. He endured these tortures and mental illness, and lived to the age of 82. George III's legs could not help but tremble slightly, but he still gritted his teeth to steady his emotions, and finally told Little Pete, "If that doesn't work, direct people's attention abroad, Mr. Prime Minister." In calm days, time always flies by. Not long after Christmas, the early spring breeze began to caress the land of France. The conference hall of the Palace of Versailles was warmed by the fireplace, and the cabinet ministers sitting around the conference table were all smiling and chatting in low voices from time to time. Obviously, in the past year, everyone was quite satisfied with their results. The topic of today's cabinet meeting is the submission of last year's statistics by various departments in the past. Joseph would discuss the areas they were responsible for individually with each minister, but he has been presiding over cabinet meetings for the past 6 months. This year, he simply put the annual summary here. On the one hand, various departments can compare with each other to increase everyone's sense of competition. On the other hand, it can also strengthen cooperation between different departments. For example, the Minister of Trade will formulate this year's work plan based on the growth rate of industry. Queen Mary sat at the head of the table. After everyone saluted, she looked at Brian with a smile and said, "Archbishop Brian, then please begin." Although she no longer cared much about specific affairs, she was always worried that these unruly ministers would dissatisfy the Crown Prince, so she insisted on coming to take charge of her son. Brian bowed to the Queen and the Crown Prince, first said some routine remarks, and then went straight to the topic. According to the arrangement of the topic, let me first explain last year's financial situation. After hearing this, all the ministers picked up the 1791 National Financial Report that had been placed on the table, and looked through it. The corners of Brian's mouth kept rising, and he couldn't hold it down. With the blessing of God and the careful management of Her Majesty the Queen and Her Royal Highness the Dauphin, the country's total fiscal revenue last year reached 740 million francs, an increase of 110 million francs from last year. In fact, the ministers had heard in advance about the huge increase in fiscal revenue, but they did not expect it to increase so much. They were all very excited immediately and nodded their congratulations to Brian. This is an annual growth rate of 17%. Even in the era of the Industrial Revolution, it was an extremely brilliant achievement. The smile on Brian's face became even thicker. He didn't even look at the document. He had obviously memorized it by heart. Last year's total fiscal expenditure was 640 million francs. In other words, we achieved a high surplus of 98 million francs. After he finished speaking, he felt a little choked up. He lowered his head and took a few deep breaths to calm down his emotions. It's no wonder he was so excited. He couldn't remember how long it had been, probably since the late years of Louis XIV. France's finances had been troubled by the nightmare of deficit, and all previous finance ministers were accused of incompetence. Finally, in this year, a historic turnaround was achieved. This is definitely a great achievement that will still be mentioned by the French more than 100 years later. Queen Mary immediately stood up excitedly, applauded Brian and said, "Thank you for your excellent and productive work. You have opened a new chapter for France and made the country full of hope again." Everyone else also stood up and applauded Brian. Brian looked at Joseph and said seriously, "All of this stems from the major financial and tax reforms led by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. I'm just following His Highness's instructions. This is definitely not modesty on his part. His ability can only be regarded as average among recent finance ministers. If His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had not made many strange moves, let alone fiscal surpluses, he might have stepped down due to debt crisis countless times in the past 2 years." All the ministers looked at Joseph in unison, and their eyes clearly said, "Indeed." Joseph smiled and said, "The French finance will always be in surplus in your hands, Archbishop Brian, and no one will ignore your huge contribution. Congratulations to you, and congratulations to France." He did not hesitate to praise Brian. After all, he was an old subordinate, and the latter was loyal to him. Everyone immediately chanted congratulations to France and congratulations to Archbishop Brian, and then praised Joseph highly. It took a long time before they sat down again. Brian continued, "This year, our total debt will be reduced to 1.98 billion francs. If the debt replacement plan is implemented smoothly, this year's fixed interest expenses can be reduced to 84 million francs. The replacement plan," he mentioned, "is to raise funds by selling low-interest government bonds to repurchase previous high-interest loans and replace high and low. But this requires a prerequisite, that is, the public is optimistic about France's development, so that the government bond interest rate can be lowered." Brian obviously thinks that there is no need to worry about the sales of government bonds, because he has read last year's industrial and agricultural reports. Everyone cheered and applauded again. Although France's total debt is still extremely high, in terms of this interest rate, it is already close to a healthy range. If this momentum is maintained, France will be able to completely get out of the shadow of debt. However, compared with the jubilation of others, Joseph seemed calmer. He knew very well that the high fiscal surplus last year was just a special case, and it would be difficult to repeat it in the future. First, a large number of tax farmers were dealt with at the beginning of the year and their property was confiscated, which brought in tens of millions of francs. In fact, due to the lack of proficiency of the tax bureau, tax revenue even declined. It was not until the implementation of the value-added tax system that the situation improved. Second, the booming special trade contributed tens of millions of francs to the treasury in just about 4 months. Chapter 610 Cake and Contradiction. Moreover, thanks to the sales volume of the smuggling trade, the output of factories across France has increased significantly, which has also increased the tax revenue by a large amount. But Joseph also knew that the smuggling business would not last long. At present, they are taking advantage of a loophole that the British have not paid enough attention to. Once the British react, under the strict inspection of their fleet and the blockade, the amount of smuggling will definitely decrease rapidly. Joseph estimates that the special trade bonus will last another year at most. Without strong naval support, Britain still cannot defeat Britain at sea. Of course, France has now completed its tax reform, abolished local taxes and most tolls, and the development momentum of industry and commerce is good. Therefore, even if these two abnormal revenues are missing, this year's fiscal year can at least ensure that there will be no deficit. When tax reform was mentioned, Joseph suddenly felt tremendous pressure again. He has carried out a lot of very radical reforms in France in the past 2 years. He would not be naive enough to think that the reform would be complete as long as it could be implemented. This is just the beginning. Any reform would involve substantial redistribution of benefits. In other words, while most people benefit from the reform, many people, or even a certain class of people, lose their vested interests. These people do not accept their fate easily. Although they are temporarily dormant and licking their wounds under the pressure of royal power, they will not hesitate to jump out and cause trouble whenever an opportunity arises, just like the tax collector group. Although the big tax collectors were beheaded, each of them had thousands of subordinates who depended on them for food, or even more. After the fall of the big tax collectors, the lives of these people must be worse than before. They must be extremely dissatisfied with the French government in their hearts, but they just dare not show it. Similar to this are the old aristocratic groups, the old military groups, and even the old police forces. In other words, France's current development momentum is pretty good, and these people can enjoy the development dividends, thus covering up the contradictions once the development momentum slows down. All kinds of contradictions will immediately break out. By then, even if the army can be used to suppress it, France will suffer huge damage. If another foreign force takes advantage of the situation, the consequences will be disastrous. Joseph's ears were filled with the cheers of the ministers, but he fell into deep thought. Therefore, France must maintain its rapid development, continue to make the cake bigger, and offset the dissatisfaction of various forces with the temptation of sharing the cake. As long as this situation lasts for more than 10 years, France will rebuild a new balance of interests at that time. Even if someone still wants to settle old scores, others will suppress them for their own rights without taking action themselves. The so-called making the cake bigger is nothing more than two ways: internal development and external expansion. After Brian finished his report, Industry Minister Mirabeau stood up and couldn't hide his smile. Last year, our country achieved great development in industry, and the overall scale expanded by 76%. This number sounds extremely alarming, but it was possible at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You must know that France is still an agricultural country with a very low industrial stock, so just building some factories can significantly increase the industrial scale. However, the rapid growth of France's industrial scale was partly due to the crazy expansion of production in order to produce the goods for the order scam. Later, special trade utilized these production capacities, which made the growth rate become so exaggerated. Mirabeau then cheerfully introduced his achievements. Last year the machinery industry grew by 110%, the steel industry grew by 72%, the coal industry grew by 265%, the chemical industry grew by 175%, brewing industry grows 12%, paper industry, furniture manufacturing, pharmaceutical industry among them. The terrifying growth rate of the coal industry is mainly due to the application of gas street lights. The distillation workshop in Paris alone uses as much coal as the entire Greater Paris area, including the Palace of Versailles and surrounding towns, for 12 days every day. Such an astonishing demand has greatly stimulated the development of the French coal industry. Now the wooden track from the Nancy coal mines to Paris has been built. After the steam engine lifted the coal from the mine, it could be transported directly to Paris without changing the carriage. At the same time, because of the huge amount of coal shipped to Paris, freight costs were greatly reduced, and coal prices also fell. Many households that had previously burned wood began to choose to burn coal, further boosting the coal industry. At present, the coal mines in Wallonia in the southern Netherlands have not been opened for mining. When cities such as Lyon and Reims also install gas street lights, coal from Wallonia will continue to flow into all parts of France. By then, the scale of France's coal industry is likely to surpass that of the United Kingdom. As for another amazing industrial growth point, the chemical industry, the main reason is that France's first factory using the royal soda production method to produce soda ash has been officially put into use, with a daily production of 2,000 kilograms of soda ash. At the same time, the cost is very low, only 1/3 of the original alkali production method. France currently sells soda ash at 70% of the market price, and has almost monopolized the entire European soda ash market, including the United Kingdom. Although the demand for soda ash is not too high, because the industries in each country are not very developed, there are still millions of francs in revenue every year. Moreover, thanks to the decline in the price of soda ash, the costs of France's soap, paper, dyes, pharmaceuticals and other products have also been significantly reduced, and its international competitiveness has rapidly improved. Especially in the South German region, which has a trade agreement with France, the above mentioned products account for at least 70% of its market. When these countries signed the agreement, they never imagined that France would even engage in dumping of soap, so they did not set protective tariffs on such products after the Queen took the lead in congratulating Mirabeau. Minister of Agriculture Vigneault began to speak eagerly. The beet sugar factory in Valois was put into operation at the end of last year, with a monthly output of 80,000 pounds of sugar. Based on the current planting scale and the construction of the sugar refinery, this year it should be able to reach a monthly output of 600,000 pounds. Although 600,000 pounds is not much, less than a week's production in Santo Domingo, sugar can be produced in Europe, which will have a disruptive effect on the entire sugar trade pattern. Vigneault then excitedly introduced the fertilizer production in France and the olive cultivation situation in Tunisia and other places at present. France has built 4 stone fertilizer crushing plants in places such as Marseille and Paris to crush and grind phosphate ores shipped from Nauru and Tunisia, which are then distributed by agricultural service consulting companies sold to farmers. Compared with farmers who use stone fertilizer directly by soaking it in water, the crushed phosphate ore is less likely to be lost, and its fertility is more than 30% higher. Chapter 611 France's Achievements. After 2 years of vigorous promotion, stone fertilizer, that is, phosphate fertilizer, has been widely accepted by French farmers. After all, this thing can really increase wheat production by more than 10%, and the price is not expensive. Phosphate, or is just stone at the place of origin, basically free of charge, and all costs are incurred in the transportation link. So it is very cheap. In addition, with the vigorous promotion of agricultural service consulting companies and churches, almost every French farmer has made new compost. Phosphate fertilizer plus compost increased France's wheat and potato production last year by about 14% compared with the previous year, and this is because a lot of land was converted to beet, otherwise it would be higher at the same time. The fertility of the land has also been significantly improved, and the fallow period has been extended from 3 years to 4 years. However, Vigneault seemed to think that this growth rate was not good enough compared to Mirabeau's amazing industrial data, so he just mentioned it in a few simple sentences. In fact, after French farmers had the right to redeem land, their willingness to improve planting technology was greatly improved than before, and various new agricultural tools and fertilizers were quickly rolled out with the help of agricultural service consulting companies. After experiencing various natural disasters in the past few years and facing the threat of famine, France's agriculture has now completely stabilized. Vigneault then talked about the olive plantations in Tunisia. In fact, France has imported olive oil from Tunisia for a long time, but due to limited quantities, the French still use butter or sunflower oil for cooking. However, Vigneault, the Minister of Agriculture, is still very diligent. When he was promoting the composting method in Tunisia at the beginning of last year, he accidentally noticed the olives there. Tunisia is definitely a paradise for olives. The plants grow rapidly, there are almost no diseases and pests, and the yield is very high. However, the olive trees here are almost unattended, growing together with shrubs and weeds, and even letting monkeys and birds eat the ripe fruits. So he thought of promoting the olive plantation model in Tunisia. After seeing his planning plan, Joseph immediately approved it and gave him additional tax reduction and tree species subsidy policy benefits. At first, Joseph just wanted to use this to develop Tunisia's economy, but unexpectedly, Vigneault did a good job and got unexpected gains in Tunisia. Olive trees are everywhere. It only takes a little money to enclose a large area of olive trees, which is basically a plantation. If the government subsidy is included, the investment is almost negligible. So many French immigrants in Tunisia and local nobles have started olive plantations, and nearby Tunisian tribes provide sufficient labor for these plantations. Even women and children in the tribe can earn a little income by doing some weeding and watering. Under the promotion of Vigneault, hundreds of plantations of various sizes were built in Tunisia in just 1 year under the careful care of the plantation owners. The olive production has increased greatly compared with the past. Last year, the total amount of olive oil shipped from Tunisia to France increased by 190%. On the other hand, Vigneault, with the support of Mirabeau, encouraged investors to build 4 large oil mills in Tunisia, which directly squeezed and barreled at the place of production. further reducing transportation costs under a series of measures. The price of olive oil in the French market is currently lower than that of sunflower oil, and the French are more and more willing to use oil when cooking. Beef with asparagus is a popular dish in Paris recently. It is fried with olive oil and is considered a petit bourgeois dish for the common people. Even bakers that are more particular will add a little olive oil to improve the taste when making black bread. In his report, Vergniaud had mentioned that 3 new oil mills will be built in Tunisia this year. Considering the expansion speed of plantations, the price of olive oil can be reduced by another 15% after the olive harvest in October. What Vergniaud did not expect at the beginning was that due to the good income of olive plantations, the Crown Prince gave a 60% tax reduction. More French people were attracted to immigrate to Tunisia to run plantations there. Number of immigrants last year was close to 100,000. Currently, there are more than 250,000 registered Tunisian immigrants. There are also many who came by boat from Italy, Spain and other places, and it is estimated that there are still 20,000 to 30,000 people. At the same time, the olive trade has also promoted the construction of towns in Tunisia. At present, with several oil mills as the center, it has gradually developed into a small town, and 2 of them have even begun to raise funds to build wooden tracks to the port of Bizet. It can be said that Vergniaud used the olive strategy to put Tunisia's development on the fast track. After the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Household Registration also spoke one after another. However, their achievements were overshadowed by the brilliance of the previous 3 and seemed a bit mediocre. Bay's biggest achievement was that the Special Trade Association had established a sales network in the Indian Peninsula, the Caribbean and Brazil, but this could not be brought to the cabinet meeting. So he could only focus on the growth of exports to Germany and Italy. Under the special sales methods of the Trade Alliance Caravan, slogans such as "Don't pay $999" and "Invite friends and relatives to cut a bargain" have been known to most of Europe, and sales are booming. In addition, the cost of French industrial products has been continuously reduced. Major products such as wine, paper, and chemicals have almost dominated the markets in southern Germany and Italy. The market share of steel, machinery, and furniture is also increasing rapidly. Even in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, French products are constantly eroding the market for British goods. The Minister of Household Registration looked at Vergniaud with resentment. Because his greatest achievement, large-scale immigration to North Africa, was just spoiled by the latter. He finally talked about conducting a census in Corsica and promoting ID cards. Even the Minister of the Navy, the Marquis of Castelli, who had no presence in the cabinet meeting for a long time, stood up and introduced the new steam-powered warships under construction and the situation of the Naval Academy. Queen Mary was also very excited when she heard the brilliant achievements of the ministers. France has made such amazing development in the past year she couldn't help but look at Joseph, thinking to herself, it seems that all these achievements came after the Crown Prince took over the cabinet. My son is indeed a son of God. His political talent is simply better than mine. No, even comparable to his grandmother. Queen Mary's mother, Maria the was the last ruler of Austria and the person she admired the most. Queen Mary couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Perhaps she should have let her son take charge earlier, but a smile soon appeared on her face again. Isn't it because of her careful teaching that her son can do so well? In the future, I will provide more support to Joseph behind the scenes to make France stronger. Chapter 612 Abolition Movement. At noon, the cabinet meeting ended. When the Minister of the Navy walked out of the golden door of the conference hall, he smiled more brilliantly than on his wedding day. But Mirabeau and other ministers of the emerging aristocracy who were not far behind him looked a little serious. After passing the corner of the corridor, Bailey glanced at Mirabeau's expression and said, "You also noticed something, right?" The latter nodded solemnly. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince gave the Navy an additional allocation of 20 million francs, which is indeed unusual. This 20 million is an allocation in addition to the normal military expenditure of the Navy. If the amount that Kelowna brought back from the UK is counted, the Navy has received an additional 40 million francs. Before that, the Navy had cut military expenditure for 3 consecutive years, and the tonnage of newly built warships was even lower than that of Russia. Bailey immediately replied, yes. In addition, His Highness also wants me to purchase a large amount of wood, grease, ropes and even cotton. It is obvious that he is worried about the obstruction of trade channels. Verniet added, it also includes grain. There is no sign of poor harvest at the moment. These matters were ordered by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince before the end of the cabinet meeting just now, so. Bailey lowered his voice. Is the war going to break out? It seems that there is a move in the UK. Talleyrand followed the 3 people with some effort. He was very familiar with the latest strategic direction of the UK. Your Highness obviously wants to prepare in advance. He suddenly paused here and shook his head and said, but it is a bit unreasonable that His Highness wants me to go to the Ottoman Empire to promote a new trade agreement at this time. Joseph's task for him was to reach an agreement with the Ottoman Empire to reduce tariffs and increase the types of goods allowed to enter. Obviously, he wanted to increase the trade volume between the 2 countries. Mirabeau was also quite puzzled. If we go to war with Britain, the Mediterranean trade should be in danger of being interrupted. Verniet immediately said, so His Royal Highness allocated 20 million funds to the Navy, probably to compete for sea control. The other people looked at him with strange eyes. Mirabeau said, then this amount of funds is probably far from enough. Bay nodded, and if you have the confidence to defeat the British at sea, there is no need to stockpile supplies. The few people discussed for a while, but still had no clue. If the Marquis of Castelli was here, he would definitely tell them excitedly that the Navy relied on the new steam-driven warships to drive the British fleet away from the Mediterranean. After the war, the Ottoman Empire on the east side of the Mediterranean will be a very important market for France. Finally, Talleyrand exhaled and said, I think we should trust His Royal Highness's judgment. The other 3 also nodded. In their memory, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's decision making has never been wrong. A few months ago, south of North America, Caribbean Sea, central St. Domingo, Port Au Prince and a embasement, Vincent Auger, the leader of the abolition movement, lit up the candle in the middle of the room, and the candle light immediately illuminated the faces of more than a dozen people sitting around the room. Most of these people were mixed race with light brown skin, and there were 4 blacks and 1 white. They were representatives of abolition organizations from all over French Saint-Domingue. Thank you all for arriving here on time. Auger walked to the front of the crowd, looked at them with a very capable look, and said in a deep voice, the Bukka movement has captured most of Tortuga, and the governor's army is now almost all gathered in the north. Our chance has come. Everyone present immediately clenched their fists excitedly and cheered with suppressed voices. Auger continued, we will gather on the east side of Port Au Prince in a week. Major Jonas and I will lead half of the people to attack the governor's palace. He looked at a middle-aged mixed-race man in a white French military uniform. Major Auriel will lead a battalion to occupy the parliament. The others will disperse to ensure the stability of Port Au Prince. The 2 officers immediately stood up and signaled, at your command, Mr. Auger. Auger waved his fist vigorously and said, we now have the same sophisticated equipment as the governor's palace guards, and Major Jonas is even equipped with cannons. We will quickly control Port Au Prince, and then ask the parliament to vote to pass the abolition bill. Everyone will be free and equal, and the dark age of St. Domingo will end from now on. The representatives of the organization in the room cheered again. When everyone quieted down, an old black man in a grey-black coarse linen coat slowly stood up and said, Mr. Auger, how should we deal with the French army from Europe? They may be about to cross the Atlantic at this time. Auge said with a resolute look, then we will fight them until they accept the abolition bill. The old black man shook his head and sighed. Mr. Auger, our current army is impossible to defeat the French expeditionary force, just like a few years ago. Auge raised his hand to interrupt him. Mr. Trock, we have received more than 1 batch of supplies before. In fact, a country has promised us that it will provide us with £30,000 of supplies every month in the future. We will win in the end. The supplies that Auger mentioned are mainly military equipment such as flintlock rifles, uniforms, tents, and some food, medicines, etc. Trock immediately showed a look of surprise. Thank God for giving us hope. He participated in 2 abolitionist uprisings, both of which were suppressed due to lack of weapons and ammunition. This time the situation is finally different. An hour later, Augur, who had made detailed arrangements for the uprising, left the basement and returned to his residence by car. Before he entered the door, his butler came out and whispered a few words in his ear. Special envoy of the French government? Augur frowned, thought for a moment, and then walked towards the room. Sitting in the living room was a middle-aged man wearing a long black coat and a somewhat disheveled wig. Augur took a deep breath, stepped forward and said loudly, "Mr. Special Envoy, if you want to persuade me to support the suppression of the Booker movement in Parliament, I'm afraid you will be disappointed." The middle-aged man stood up when he heard the noise, caressed his chest, and saluted Augur. When the latter saw his big nose, forehead wrinkles, and deep eyes, he couldn't help but exclaimed, You are Mr. Brisset." Brisset smiled and nodded. "That's my name. You should be Mr. Augur. It's an honor to meet you." Augur hurriedly bowed in return. "I once listened to your speech in Philadelphia. Oh, I also have your miscellaneous notes of Negroes and the American South in my bookcase, which is very true. I'm glad you enjoyed that book." Augur suddenly thought of something, suppressed his excitement and said, "The King of France sent you as a special envoy. Could it be?" Brisset nodded. "Yes, His Majesty has agreed to sign the abolition of slavery." Chapter 613 Sugar War. Augur was stunned for several seconds. His eyes widened suddenly, and he said in disbelief, "Are you serious?" Brisset still nodded. "It's absolutely true. Your Majesty's order is on me." Augur suppressed his excitement and asked, "So, how much does each black slave have to pay for himself?" Brisset patted his arm. "There will be no fees and no restrictions. My friends, everyone will be completely free." Augur's heart was beating wildly, but he looked at him with suspicious eyes. "You are not here to delay time, but there is an army on the way to Port-au Prince. I swear to God," Brisset said seriously, "there is no conspiracy, no army. Slavery in Saint-Domingue has become history." Augur confirmed it several times, and finally no longer had any doubts. He began to cross himself desperately, but he was speechless for a long time. The dream he had been working towards for decades suddenly came true. Only then did he notice that Brisset was still standing. He hurriedly moved a chair and said politely, "Please sit down quickly. This is indeed a bit sudden. Can you tell me why your Majesty decided to show great mercy?" Brisset immediately told him patiently about the king and the crown prince's recognition and practice of the ideas of freedom, equality, human rights, and fraternity. As a veteran abolitionist, this stuff comes right out of his mouth. Then, he solemnly took out the Edict of Abolition and handed it to Augur. The latter held the edict and nodded excitedly. "Long live His Majesty the King. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Oh, Mr. Brisset, let's go to Parliament and announce the decree." Brisset raised his hand to stop him. "Mr. Augur, I'm sorry, the order cannot be made public yet." Augur was stunned for a moment, then said angrily, "I knew this was just a scam. No, you have to believe in His Majesty's determination to abolish slavery." Brisset said hurriedly, "The Saint-Domingue Assembly can immediately pass a resolution to abolish slavery, and I guarantee that the slave-holding members will also vote in favor. The French government will express opposition and even send troops to show off, but there will never be any substantive action." Augur sneered, "Why do you have to do this?" Brisset sighed helplessly, "Please understand the government's difficulties. You know that public abolition of slavery will seriously affect the interests of other countries, such as Britain, whose large plantations in Jamaica, the Bahamas and the West Indies had to rely on black slaves to work. If the French government announces the abolition of slavery, black slaves in other countries will follow suit and demand the restoration of freedom. Then France will definitely face serious diplomatic pressure. So we can only proceed in secret." Augur sat down slowly. He knew the envoy was right. At present, Britain, the United States, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands and other countries are all keeping slaves, and they will definitely strongly oppose France's abolition policy. and if France receives too much international pressure, it is likely to give up the decision to abolish slavery. I'm sorry, I just lost my temper. He bowed to indicate, and soon said with hope, this will take some time, but the abolition of slavery will definitely be accepted by all countries. Oh, the UK you mentioned just now actually supports the abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue. The Duke of Leeds came to Port-au-Prince not long ago, to provide funding for the abolition movement. Augur didn't spill the beans. He was telling Brissett that, if the French government does not keep its commitments, we have other options. He then smiled and waved his hands. But now there is no need for the abolition movement, so we will not continue to contact the British. Brissett, however, was wary and asked hurriedly, you mean, the British support you? That's right. What funding did they provide? This frankly, I know you're brewing a riot. Are the British involved? Augur hesitated, nodded, and admitted, we are preparing for an armed protest. The Duke of Leeds is also involved in this plan. He brought some flintlocks and cannons, and promised to provide £30,000 of supplies every month. The British never expected that the French government would voluntarily abandon Saint-Domingue, which made them immediately lose value in the eyes of abolitionist organizations, and be easily betrayed. Augur showed his sincerity, looked at Brissett and said, I assure you that our armed forces will be disbanded immediately after the Parliament passes the Slavery Abolition Act. No, your army needs to continue to exist. Brissett stopped mid-sentence. According to the previous plan of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, Augur's armed forces will secretly cooperate with the army of the Governor of Saint-Domingue to drive the lunatics of the Booker movement to British Jamaica and let them slaughter the British there. On the other side, the French army in Saint-Domingue will pretend to be defeated by Augur's army and throw a large amount of weapons and equipment to them, and then let Augur's abolitionist forces spread to the Bahamas and the West Indies, eventually destroying the entire Caribbean. The slave plantation economy was completely destroyed. By then, France would have lost Saint-Domingue, while Britain would have lost almost all of its sugarcane producing areas, as well as a large number of cotton plantations in Jamaica and other places. Even the abolition movement can affect Brazil, causing heavy damage to Britain's little follower Portugal. Brazil is Portugal's economic pillar, as France was the first victim of the abolitionist movement. No one would doubt that France was behind it. If sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which account for 80% of the world's total sugar production, are wiped out in large numbers, French sugar produced from beets will gain European sugar pricing power. But at this time, Augur suddenly said that the British were also involved in the abolition movement in Saint-Domingue. So the plan might be slightly modified. Brissett thought for a moment, and said to Augur, we will talk about your army later. I would like to convey some of His Majesty's expectations first. Augur frowned slightly, but still nodded and said, I'm willing to serve your Majesty. Brissett took out the document that had been prepared and handed it to him. Your Majesty believes that after the abolition of slavery, the property of all Saint-Domingue people should be respected. No one should harm the plantation owner, as it should be. Brissett continued, and the plantation needs workers to maintain operations. So after the blacks are freed, they have to continue working in the plantation where they originally worked for 2 years. Of course, they will get due remuneration and respect from the plantation owner. Augur thought for a while and nodded. This is also acceptable. He also knew that black slaves had no property and had to rely on plantations to survive after they were freed. As long as they were paid, they would be happy to stay. Brissett glanced at Augur and continued, the plantations destroyed by Booker's riots should be compensated, and those thugs must be severely punished. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 614 Sponsors from the UK. These conditions ensured that the interests of the planters of Saint-Domingue would not be greatly infringed. As for the wages paid to black people, this part can be temporarily compensated by the Saint-Domingue government through tax cuts. When chaos breaks out in the Caribbean, the price of sugar cane will inevitably skyrocket. The sugarcane plantations in Saint-Domingue will even make more money than before, and no one will care about the little wages of course. The British will not sit back and watch France make a lot of money from the sugar of Saint-Domingue. They will definitely try to cut off the water channel of Port-au-Prince, based on the principle of if I'm not good, no one can think of it. Joseph also expected this situation to occur, so he had already prepared another big killer weapon point that night. Brice had returned to the villa of the Marquis Fidel de la Valletrie, his residence in Port-au-Prince, and had a detailed discussion with the intelligence officials who came with him about the British intervention in Saint-Domingue, and revised the Crown Prince's plan point early the next morning. Brice had told Auger about the arrangements for the troops affiliated with the abolitionist organization, and the latter agreed without much hesitation. Point after Brice had left, Auger immediately rushed to the previous basement to convene a meeting with representatives of the abolitionist organization. Point under the excited gaze of more than a dozen representatives. Auger recounted the French government's decision to abolish slavery and was interrupted several times by excited cheers. Then he relayed the French government's request and finally said, "And our troops will be retained and fulfill some of their obligations to assist the government in resolving the Bouka riots. Solving the problem within the framework of the existing order is undoubtedly the optimal solution. At this time, the Bouka movement, which continues to massacre white people and attempts to destroy the framework, has become the enemy of the abolitionist organization." Auger looked at a mixed-race officer, Major Jonas. "We will cooperate with the governor's army to drive the Bouka rebels to the north of Tortuga. There will be some ships waiting there to pick up these thugs. The Marquis de la Valletrie will send someone to give you the specific combat plan. I need you to assemble the army as soon as possible and take action immediately after the abolition of slavery bill is passed." "Okay, Mr. Auger." 3 days later, the Assembly of Saint-Domingue voted on the abolition bill submitted by Auger. The governor had previously received instructions from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and ordered the slaver-holding MPs not to object. At 10:30 in the morning, the slavery abolition bill passed with a high vote. The whole of Santo Domingo was shaken. The black slaves were taken off their shackles and rushed into the streets excitedly, shouting and crying bitterly. Abolitionist Major Rochemort led troops in the streets to maintain order, while the governor's men pacified the planters. The entire day passed without any violence. At noon the next day, the Marquis of La Valletrie led the governor's army to attack the Buck rebels from the east side of Tortuga. At the same time, 1,200 soldiers under Major Jonas, armed with British brown bess flintlock muskets, appeared on the south side of Tortuga. Tortuga is located in the northwest corner of Santo Domingo. It has a peninsula-like terrain, facing the Caribbean Sea on its north and west sides, so the two armies are equivalent to completely blocking the road of the Bouka rebels. Just 3 days later, the black slave rebels, who lacked weapons and ammunition, were compressed near a small port on the north side of Tortuga. On a rock in the port, Bouka held up a telescope with a cracked lens and saw that the governor's army in white uniforms had completed its assembly a few miles away. Due to the lack of reconnaissance means, the specific strength of the enemy's troops was unknown, but he estimated that there were at least 1,500 men. And he also knew that thousands of soldiers commanded by mixed-race people in the south would arrive here soon. The more than 800 revolting black soldiers under his command only had 300 guns, and they could not possibly be their opponents. He looked at the low setting sun, cursed all the white people in a low voice, turned around and returned to the camp, ready to enjoy the last day of his life. At this moment, his bodyguard appeared in front of him with an old black man with shriveled skin. Bouka's eyes were suddenly filled with murderous intent. He drew his sword from his waist and put it against the old man's chest, saying fiercely, "Troc, you bastard who sold your soul to the white devil. Thank my ancestors for letting me catch you. I will skin you and sacrifice it to the spirit of nature." Troc looked at him calmly and said, "Bouka, I'm here to save you. Ha, just because you are such an old man?" Bouka laughed. "Can you get me 500 flintlock guns? If not, just shut up. I know where the boat is." The surroundings instantly became quiet. All the black soldiers looked directly at the old man. "There is a British gentleman who sympathizes with your plight and is ready to take you away on his merchant ship. The old man said. Point at night. Point. The torches were still burning in Booker's camp, but all the black rebels followed Troker westward along the coast. Point. After walking for about 3 or 4 hours, Booker saw a huge merchant ship parked on the sea in the distance under the moonlight. Several small boats were quickly put down on the ship, and after more than 10 round trips, Booker and his soldiers were finally picked up on the ship. Point. A mixed race. Middle-aged man walked out of the cabin and opened his arms to Booker. My hero, you do not deserve to die in Santo Domingo. Booker doesn't understand English. A soldier not far away rushed over to help him translate. Point. Booker smiled when he heard this, turned around and hugged the British businessman tightly, and said in a deep voice, "Thank you for your help. May the ancestors bless you." The latter smiled and said, "I'm helping the Duke of Leeds with business. There are many weapons on this ship. I can give them all to you." "Really? Thank you so much." The British businessman pointed to the north again. "There are too many enemies in Saint Domingue now, so I suggest you choose a new foothold." Booker had read some books and hesitated. "You mean the Bahamas?" No, that place is no bigger than Santo Domingo, and it is not enough for you to accomplish your great work." The British businessman shook his head. "Further north, the United States. There are a large number of cotton plantations there, and millions of black people are enslaved. As long as if you go and rescue them, you will soon have tens of thousands of soldiers." Booker thought for a moment, patted his shoulder and nodded vigorously. "You are right. That is where I should go." At this moment, one of his officers came out of the cabin and whispered something into his ear. Booker's eyes suddenly lit up. "Are there thousands of flintlock muskets?" He immediately looked at the British businessman again, grinned and said, "Are those for me?" He was already prepared to kill him and his crew members after arriving in the United States if the other party said no, and then use those guns to arm black people in the United States. Point. However, the British businessman also grinned. "If you like it, take them all. The matching ammunition is right next to it. Just one request I have is that when you achieve great things, don't forget the support the Duke of Leeds gave you." Chapter 615. Black Hurricane. The armed merchant ship Deep Warehouse had its main and auxiliary sails fully opened, and coupled with the push of the Gulf of Mexico current, it only took a week to sail, and it had already seen the coast of Georgia in the distance. Point. The Intelligence Bureau contacted the Special Trade Association a few days ago, and at this time a small smuggling ship was picking up the ship offshore. Point. In fact, the US Coast Guard has almost no decent boats. But for the sake of safety, the Deep Warehouse waited until dusk before the smuggling boat led it to dock near a deserted beach in southeastern Georgia. Booker and his men immediately moved the weapons, ammunition, food and other items from the merchant ship ashore. Looking up, they saw the vast plains buried in the night. Point. His heart was filled with fear and excitement for the rest of his life. He immediately took out a wooden totem and placed it on the ground. He knelt down to thank his ancestors for their blessing. Point. After he finished praying, the British businessman happily came up to him, gave him a map, and warned, "Great hero, this is the state of Georgia in the United States. There are large cotton plantations to the north and west, and countless black people are suffering there, and to the south is the Savannah River, and on the other side of the river is the territory of the Indians. They also hate white people. If the battle does not go well, you can cross the river and ask for help from them. At least you can defend the White Army based on the river. Also, the dense forest to the west will provide you with cover." At this time, the territory of the United States was limited to the area east of the Missouri River and north of Florida. Even Florida was still a Spanish colony. Point. There were even several larger Indian tribes active between Florida and the US territories. Georgia is adjacent to Florida and Indian-controlled areas, and can quickly retreat into the Atlantic Ocean to the east. It can be said to be an excellent place for trouble. Booker carefully put away the map and was about to say goodbye to his British friends when he suddenly looked up and saw the neat gun bay of the deep cargo illuminated by lights. He grinned at his British friends and asked his men to dismantle the 9-pounder and 4-pounder guns on the ship without any hesitation. Point. In fact, the ship was equipped with an 18-pounder gun, but it was too heavy and he had no horses and could not move it at all. "Thank you, Mr. Robin." Booker made a voodoo prayer gesture. "I will return these things to you 10 times 100 times in the future." The British businessman smiled and waved. I didn't do anything. Please thank the Duke of Leeds. Oh, his full name is Francis Godolphin Osborne. 2 days later, several mixed-race reconnaissance troops returned to the woods where Booker's rebels were hiding, and reported to Booker the situation nearby. Booker marked the nearby plantations on the map, discussed it with his officers, and finally pointed to the Alplant Manor in the North Point. According to the information brought back by the scouts, there were nearly 200 black slaves there, while there were no more than 30 white people. Early the next morning, while the plantation owner Plant and his family were still sleeping, gunshots suddenly sounded vaguely in the distance. Mrs. Plant pushed her husband hard. Evans, what happened? Evans. Plant rolled over and muttered, the nigger must have broken the chain again, and Ryan is leading the chase. I hope Ryan won't be shot like last time. However, the gunfire became increasingly intensive. Plant realized something was wrong, opened his eyes suddenly, and grabbed the shotgun beside the bed. As soon as he and his 2 sons walked out of the villa, they saw Ryan, the supervisor and captain, with his face covered in blood, rushing over on horseback and shouting, quick, run. There are too many niggers, and there are guns. Niggers? Plant waved his shotgun. How many are there? At least 200 people. More. Then 10 minutes later, the Plant family fled westward on horseback, with the town of Melly just 10 miles over their. However, as soon as they ran across the endless cotton fields, they saw more than 20 black men in white military uniforms pointing guns at them. No, don't shoot. You can have whatever you want. Plant was just halfway through shouting when the black men pulled the trigger without hesitation. Just 4 hours later, 31 heads were placed at Booker's feet, while Plant's daughter and 2 other white overseers were hung from the wooden frame used to torture black slaves. Surrounding them were more than 300 soldiers from the Booker movement and nearly 200 black slaves from the plantation. Other soldiers continued to search around the plantation for whites who had slipped through. Booker listened to the pop sound of his men whipping the white people and the screams of the white people, and waved his hands vigorously to the trembling black slaves. You are free. The great god Legba protects you. Now, everyone pray with me to the gods and ancestors, then take up arms, and kill all the damn white people. The black slaves looked at each other. They didn't understand French. When Booker's men translated, most of the black slaves were so frightened that they burst into tears, and told Booker that they were dead. There were also a dozen brave ones who squeezed out of the crowd, came behind Booker, and knelt down to the totem pole together. In the following week, Booker's army attacked 3 plantations one after another, and the team expanded to nearly 1,000 people. In fact, there have been many black slave uprisings in the United States before, but they basically lacked organization or the leaders had no command skills, and without exception they were easily suppressed. This time, the Americans were beaten to a pulp by the Booker movement, which was trained in the blood and fire of St. Domingo. In history, Booker and his group fought hard with the regular army in St. Domingo, until the governor mobilized more than 2,000 soldiers to defeat them. Because the United States is vast and sparsely populated, and Booker never left anyone alive, it was not until 10 days later that the Savannah militia got the news and hurriedly sent out 400 troops to suppress it. According to their previous experience, such a large army was enough to deal with any rebellious black devil. But when they arrived at the town of Melly, which was occupied by rebellious black slaves, they suddenly heard the roar of cannons behind them, and more than a dozen soldiers were smashed into pieces by 12-pound iron balls and scattered everywhere. The American soldiers were instantly thrown into panic, and then thousands of blacks holding brown Bess flintlock rifles pressed towards them from both sides. 2 days later, the mayor of Savannah, Michael Hayden, looked at the urgent military report in his hand, his face pale. The main force of the city militia had been defeated by the rebellious black slaves, and more than 180 people died. At present, the black slaves are approaching Savannah, while Booker was advancing triumphantly. In St. Domingue, Brissett was holding a meeting with Augur, Governor Mabley and several heavyweight congressmen that could affect the entire Caribbean region. Chapter 616. Since you insist on joining in the fun, don't blame me for being cruel. In the conference room on the second floor of the Port-au-Prince Parliament Hall, Augur and 3 abolitionist members looked at Brissett in amazement as he was making an impassioned speech, and tried several times to stop him from continuing. The other two slave-holding congressmen were already stunned. Brissett didn't care at all about the looks of the crowd, raised his arms and shouted loudly. We cannot be satisfied with the liberation of the black slaves in Saint-Domingue, but should let this great cause shine throughout the Caribbean. The evil and shameful institution of slavery must disappear from this world. Jamaica, Barnabas, and even the West Indies, where the whip of sin is still lashing the blacks who should be free, and we, the spreaders of the spirit of freedom, have an army that can fight the slaveholders and have the support of 500,000 free black people. What reason do we have not to rescue the slaves in the Caribbean? Finally, Ogay stood up bravely and said, Mr. Brissett, we really want to abolish slavery in other Caribbean areas, but it seems that this should be done by the British and Spanish themselves. Other congressmen nodded. Interfering in those places is likely to lead to retaliation from Britain and other countries. Mr. Brissett, the abolition of slavery is an issue that will take a long time to resolve, even if we wanted to push for abolition across the Caribbean. I'm afraid we wouldn't have enough power. Sorry, we really can't do this. Brissett looked around at the crowd and said with mockery in his eyes, is this what you mean by breaking the shackles and letting freedom and equality shine on every inch of the land that God looks at? Just by liberating 500,000 black slaves in Saint-Domingue, does that mean you have realized your ideal? Augur had no choice but to say, okay, Mr. Brissett, to be honest, this is not in our interests. So, you mean benefits? Brissett smiled. Then if I tell you that Saint-Domingue can gain independence, will such benefits satisfy you? The conference room fell silent for a moment. Augur and others looked at each other, then looked at Brissett. Sorry, I don't understand. Is this a metaphor of yours? Or, no, it is independence? Brissett said calmly, establish the Republic of Saint-Domingue, and your parliament will mint currency, decide trade methods, tariffs, diplomacy, army, etc. The French government will not have any interference with you. A middle-aged congressman suddenly laughed. Mr. Special Envoy, you really know how to joke. No, I'm not kidding. Brissett took out an edict from his body. His Majesty the King has agreed to abandon the colony of Saint-Domingue and establish your own country. Orge hurriedly took the order and saw the signatures and royal seals of the King and Queen on it. His hands trembled with excitement and he handed it to the congressman beside him. For a moment, everyone's face turned red with excitement. Their eyes shone, and they confirmed with each other whether they had made a mistake. If they can get rid of their colonial status, they will gain great benefits. For example, they will not have to pay taxes to the French government. The market will not be open only to France. They will mint their own currency, conduct financial management, etc. Especially these MPs, they will jump from a humble colonial MP to a national MP, and the power in their hands will increase countless times. You know, before Joseph only promised to reduce the tax rate in Saint-Domingue by 70% and give Parliament greater power, he could get most of the slave-holding MPs to support the abolition of slavery. And these are just a few of the many benefits of independent nationhood. For a moment, Augur took the lead and waved his fists and shouted, long live His Majesty the King. Thank you for granting freedom and independence to Saint-Domingue. When other congressmen were about to join in the cheers, Brissett raised his hand and interrupted them. Gentlemen, there are preconditions for your Majesty to allow Saint-Domingue to become independent. All eyes turned to him immediately. First of all, His Majesty demands that slavery be abolished in the entire Caribbean. Secondly, the island of Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the West Indies must also achieve independence. It is best to form a Caribbean confederation with Saint-Domingue. The members of the House of Representatives heard this and started talking in low voices. To be honest, it is indeed extremely difficult, but the temptation of Saint-Domingue to establish an independent country is obviously greater. Brissett waited for a moment and then said, the French government will also provide weapons and ammunition to Saint-Domingue, as well as annual financial support of 2 million francs. Augur and Governor Mabley looked at each other, swallowed hard, looked at Brissett and said, Mr. Special Envoy, let us discuss it and give you a reply before noon tomorrow. Okay, gentlemen. But I must remind everyone that this matter must be kept strictly confidential. Brissett did not wait until noon the next day. At 10 o'clock that night, Auger and Mably came to his room together, saying that Saint-Domingue would be bound to lead the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean. These two old rivals, who had been fighting in the Council of Saint-Domingue for more than 10 years, seemed unusually united at this time. Then Auge said with a sad face, "But you know, Mr. Special Envoy, this is not easy to do." Brissett smiled and nodded, and asked his entourage to summon an intelligence bureau officer. "This is Major Delman. He's going to present you with a simple plan." Delman handed 2 documents to Auger and Mably. "We must first ensure that other countries believe that the French government is against abolition. Otherwise France will be under pressure and will not be able to provide support to Saint-Domingue." Auge and Mably nodded. Delman continued, "So the governor's army and the abolitionist army will maintain a state of war on the surface, since the British accidentally interfered in the situation in Saint-Domingue. Mr. Brissett and I plan to take advantage of this." Auge was a little surprised. "How to use this?" Delman raised the document in his hand. "The French government will announce in a high-profile manner that, in order to punish the Saint-Domingue Parliament's decision to abolish slavery, it will send 10,000 expeditionary forces to the island to eliminate the abolitionists, and Mr. Auger used this as an excuse to ask the British for help, saying that if no more aid is given, the abolitionist movement can only surrender to the French government. It would be better to let them pay a large amount of aid at one time, rather than a little bit every month. At that time, a slave-holding member of parliament will happen to hear your conversation and make it public. You will then unable to bear the pressure to admit it. Then your army will defeat the governor's army, seize a large amount of weapons and equipment, and thousands of the governor's soldiers will surrender and be incorporated into your army." Auge's eyes widened. This is also possible," Brissett continued. "When the government's expeditionary force lands, it will be ambushed by your army, and then defeated and retreated to British Jamaica. You will seize more weapons and supplies, and even a few warships." Chapter 617. At another fire. On the pier of Port-au-Prince, the Duke of Leeds, dressed as a sugar merchant, quickly boarded the merchant ship Warm Wind. As I write this, I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network. "These stupid and greedy mulattoes." He glanced back at the island, shaking his head in a sarcastic tone. "Do they think they are the emperors of the Caribbean? How dare they ask me for £300,000 assistance?" The mulattoes he refers to are the common names for people of mixed race. Be careful with the heartbeat. The Duke of Leeds' assistant supported him and echoed, "They have the blood of niggers. How can they have noble character? Greed is their outstanding characteristic, but these guys are quite good at fighting. They defeated Mably's army in less than half a month." The Duke of Leeds lit the deck with his cane and walked towards the bow cabin, saying disdainfully, "It's just that the French are too useless. They always like to talk about freedom and equality. Ha, now they are really equal to the niggers. This is a good thing for us." The assistant said, "Yes, Saint-Domingue will have to pay salaries to its free black citizens in the future, which will increase the cost of their plantations by more than 20%. We no longer have to worry about French sugar competition." The Duke of Leeds asked him to help him. The assistant who opened the door nodded, "And I can leave this hellish place early." After learning that the abolitionist group had defeated the governor's army, he immediately decided to return to England. And that Auger naively thought he had won some great battle, and actually asked the United Kingdom to provide diplomatic support and £300,000 of material assistance. It's a joke. He and his abolitionist organization are just tools used to destroy Saint-Domingue. They really regard themselves as allies of Britain. The Duke of Leeds came to the Bahamas with the Warm Wind, where he transferred to a British warship and returned to Europe. After all, third-class battleships are much faster and more stable than merchant ships. However, when he sailed to Bermuda and entered the port for supplies, a warship from Britain also stopped here. The officials on the ship learned that the Duke of Leeds was on the island and hurried to hand over the Foreign Secretary's urgent instructions. The Duke of Leeds took out the codebook, frowned and translated the secret message. His expression soon became solemn, and he ordered his assistant, "Contact a merchant ship for me. I want to return to Port-au-Prince." The secret letter read, "The French government has officially announced that it will send 10,000 expeditionary troops to suppress the rebellion in Saint-Domingue. The Foreign Secretary authorized the Duke of Leeds to do all he could to help the abolitionist organizations in Saint-Domingue to ensure that the chaos there would not end. Damn it. The Duke of Leeds tore the translation into pieces and threw it into the sea. Then he returned to the cabin and wrote a reply to Lord Grenville, requesting £300,000 of funding. Paris surrounded by a dozen officers. Joseph walked out of the Paris Military Technical School. Your effective work has enabled the school to run well. He tilted his head and praised the military school officials beside him. As for the war horses, I will ask the General Staff to allocate some to you as much as possible. But there is no need to add too much riding skills. Courses are enough to ensure that most soldiers will not fall off their horses. After all, training cavalry is the responsibility of the Army Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. The Dean of Academic Affairs bowed with some regret and said, "Yes, Your Highness, I will bear in mind your instructions." He originally wanted to take the opportunity to add dragoon courses. This unit basically only requires horseback riding and will dismount and line up during battle, so it is easier to train. But His Royal Highness the Crown Prince rejected it. It's not that Joseph doesn't want to increase the number of cavalry, but the Paris Military Technical School, which was split from the Paris Police Academy, has enrolled more than 6,000 new students this year. At the same time, the instructors have allocated a lot of points to the military schools in Lyon and Toulouse to ensure that the infantry. The quality of training with the Gijas is already very difficult. A war in Europe may break out at any time. We must first ensure the goal of adding 50,000 soldiers within 2 years, and it is better not to distract the military technical schools at the bottom. President Joseph encouraged the Dean of Provosts and other officials. Just as he was about to get into the carriage, he saw Fouche coming quickly, bowed to him, and then said quickly, "Your Highness, this is news from the Caribbean." The Dauphin ordered him to report the situation in Saint-Domingue to him as soon as possible, so after receiving the information from there, he immediately rushed to the Tuileries Palace and then pursued him here. Joseph motioned for him to get in the car and asked, "Is everything going well?" "Overall, it went smoothly, Your Highness." Fouche handed over the translated information. However, some unexpected situations occurred, and Mr. Brisset and Delman temporarily adjusted the plan. Joseph waited for him to briefly introduce the situation in Saint-Domingue, then nodded slightly and said, "I didn't expect the British to attack Saint-Domingue so early." Brisset and the others dealt with it well. This will cause the UK to get into a lot of trouble. But if Booker goes to the United States, our textile industry will have to make some preparations in advance. The next thing we have to do is protest against the UK and try to expand the international impact of this matter. He looked at Fouche again and said, "However, the Duke of Leeds does not currently hold a position in the British government, so Peter is likely to say that it is just his personal behavior." Fouche nodded. "I'm afraid that's the case, Your Highness. But this is already very embarrassing for the British. We have to find a way to keep the British government at bay." Joseph thought for a moment and asked Fouche, "Do you think the British know the situation in the United States now?" "They probably don't know, Your Highness." Mr. Brisset sent back the information. "After sending Booker to the United States, it will take at least half a month for those niggers to arrive in the United States and then make trouble. That means we have half a month to do this." Joseph nodded, and someone immediately came to his mind. "Do you know Wilberforce, Your Highness?" "Are you talking about William Wilberforce, the second Chancellor of the British Exchequer?" "Yes, he is the leader of British abolitionism." Fouche immediately added, "Yes, Your Highness, the Clapham Saints." Clapham Saints is an important force in the British anti-slave trade movement. Since slavery has been abolished in the United Kingdom, British abolitionism is called anti-slave trade. Joseph nodded. "Then let's drag more people from this organization into the water." "You send people to Britain immediately and do this." "Yes, Your Highness." A few days later, a British abolitionist journalist got in touch with London City Councillor Earl Middleton through the Chamber of Commerce, and through the latter, got the opportunity to interview the second Chancellor of the Exchequer Wilberforce. Chapter 618 The Anger of Americans. Number 3 Clapham Street Point. Google searched work and reporter looked at Wilberforce eagerly and said, "So, have you heard about the passage of the abolition bill on a certain island?" In fact, the members of the Clapham Saints only heard that the St. Domingo Parliament passed the abolition bill, and the specific details were not clear, but the reporter just brought them the latest news from the newspaper, so they had no doubts. Wilberforce nodded. "Yes, it's really exciting news for me." "What is your attitude towards the abolition bill?" "I have always opposed the inhumane slave trade, so any behavior that can liberate slaves should be encouraged." As a government official, Wilberforce could only say some official words, and then he looked at Thomas Clarkson, a member of the Clapham Saints. The latter obviously had no scruples, and said with a smile, "The French persecuted those West African blacks extremely cruelly, and now the slaves are retaliating against them. This is a great victory for the abolition movement. I wish St. Domingo, the free blacks on that island, and their allies can make the slave owners pay the price they deserve." "Haha, you can't publish these." Several other members of the Clapham Saints immediately laughed. The British have always been very happy to see the French suffer a setback. In fact, the British have far more black slaves in Jamaica, the West Indies and other places than the French, but double standards have always been what they are best at. Earl Middleton said on the side, "It is well known that the French treat black slaves the most cruelly in the world, and it is not surprising that they are in the situation today." The reporter interviewed for a long time, and made Wilberforce and others seem quite familiar with the situation in St. Domingo through leading questions. The next day, the reporter gave the written interview manuscript to Wilberforce for a viewpoint. The latter only read it roughly, and saw that it did not mention specific names such as St. Domingo, so he agreed to publish the article in tomorrow's newspaper, since Wilberforce was a famous abolitionist. His support for the abolition of slavery would improve his political prestige. At the same time, this matter could disgust the French, so he naturally would not refuse. So the newspaper soon published his interview about the abolition of slavery on a certain island, and it was soon reprinted in many countries, even in American newspapers. Wilberforce didn't realize until then that he had fallen into a trap. The reporter was naturally arranged by the French intelligence agency. Many of the situations in St. Domingo that he introduced to Wilberforce and others had not yet been reported to Britain. For example, Orga's army defeated the government army in St. Domingo, and the people of the Booker movement fled St. Domingo, etc. These all happened more than a month ago. The French intelligence agency had long known that Orga's army had defeated the government army in St. Domingo, and the people of the Booker movement fled St. Domingo, etc. The plan was so hot that the news could be sent back to Europe as quickly as possible, but the British would not know about it for at least a week. After all, there was no internet in this era, and you had to send people to the scene to find out what happened. But Wilberforce got a spoiler from the reporter and wrote it into the interview. More than half a month later, the news of a serious slave riot in the United States finally reached Europe. People soon learned that the Black Devils sweeping across Georgia, the United States, were the Booker riots driven into the sea by the government forces of St. Domingo. Then there was another explosive news. Those rioting blacks spread the word that it was the great Duke of Leeds who provided them with weapons. When they were defeated by the army of the governor of St. Domingo, it was the Duke of Leeds' ship that sent them to the United States. These blacks even forced American craftsmen to erect a statue of the Duke of Leeds in the town of Merry. His full name was engraved on the base of the statue. St. James's Palace. In the reception room on the second floor, the American envoy Connor Tristan was handing a note to Lord Grenville, who had just returned home, with a cold face. "If you can't give a reasonable explanation, then your country's behavior will be regarded as a provocation to the United States." Tristan roared angrily, almost to the point of disregarding diplomatic etiquette. Thousands of people in Georgia have been killed by Booker's mob. Nearly 1/3 of the plantations have been destroyed, and more plantation owners have chosen to leave their homes for refuge due to concerns about their own safety. Currently, Savannah is under siege by more than 1,300 blacks, and there are more than 70,000 people living there. Once it is breached, the consequences will be disastrous. So far no white person who has fallen into the hands of those brutal blacks has survived, and most of them have been tortured and killed. More than a month ago, more than 50 white people in a plantation were all thrown into boiling water and boiled to death, which shocked the whole United States. Lord Grenville took a deep breath and argued, "I think those blacks are completely trying to frame the Duke of Leeds. I can assure you that he has absolutely nothing to do with this matter." Tristan said coldly, "You may have seen the interview with Mr. Wilberforce more than a month ago in the newspaper. He was obviously very familiar with the situation in St. Domingo. He had already told many details when the incident happened only a month ago. At that time, the news could not have been transmitted back to Europe. We can only explain that he was one of the participants and knew the inside story in advance." Lord Grenville cursed in his heart. Why did the Duke of Leeds tell this to Wilberforce, an abolitionist? And Wilberforce, this fool, actually told such a secret to the reporter. He had to pretend to be confused. There are many possibilities, such as Mr. Wilberforce happened to send someone to St. Domingo to handle official business and accidentally witnessed this. In fact, I remember that in that interview, Mr. Wilberforce did not mention St. Domingo at all. Your words can't even fool a child. Tristan shouted, "I hope your country can give our country a reasonable explanation for this matter and compensate our country for our losses." No, you are too arbitrary. I reiterate that our country has nothing to do with the abolition of slavery in St. Domingo. I will send a formal note to your country later. Tristan protested for a long time, but it didn't work, and he had to leave in anger at this time. The United States was still just a poor and backward country. Even if the world hegemon Britain really wanted to deal with them, they had no way to deal with them. However, as an important source of raw materials, the United States can make some small moves in trade to retaliate against the British. Tristan just came out of the reception room and saw the French envoy Segur passing by him with an angry face and rushed into the hall. Chapter 619 The Great Franco-American Alliance. Search TWKAN on Google. London. On the easternmost side of Downing Street, in a high-end cafe run by a Frenchman. Segur waved his hand vigorously and said angrily to Tristan, "The UK is destroying order in North America and the Caribbean." He originally lodged a diplomatic protest with Britain, but unexpectedly met the American envoy, so he invited the latter for an informal meeting. The US envoy appeared to be more restrained. "Count Segur, I think this may just be a personal act of a British abolitionist." As a senior diplomat, he knew that the Duke of Leeds had just conveyed his intention to strengthen diplomatic relations between the two countries to the US government not long ago. To this end, the British will support the United States' territorial claims to the Indian settlements. In fact, they will give up supporting the Indians, strengthen trade between the two countries, and open more British markets to the United States. Logically speaking, it should not cheat the United States by changing hands. Segur sneered. "The whole world can see what the British want to do. Your country's cotton production is increasing rapidly, which will seriously lower the price of cotton in the British Far East colonies. So they chose to use black slave thugs to destroy your plantation." Tristan couldn't help but frown slightly. He must admit that the French envoy's statement was not unreasonable. Then the Duke of Leeds' previous visit to Philadelphia was to paralyze the US government. He secretly decided in his heart that after returning, he would submit a report to Parliament to warn of the risks from Britain. Segur said in a slightly oppressive tone, "So, how is your country going to punish Britain for its behavior?" I have made solemn representations to Lord Grenville to protest against them." Segur shook his head. "Listen to me. Your country is too dependent on Britain's trade, which makes them confident to harm your interests. As allies, we should do something to change this situation. Yes, our country also suffered huge losses this time, and St. Domingo was thrown into chaos by the British. We must unite." Tristan suddenly showed interest. He belongs to the Hawks of the United States. Otherwise Washington would not have entrusted him with the task of holding Britain accountable. However, he also knew that as a small country, the United States did not have the strength to retaliate against Britain. But if France can be used to punish Britain, it would be a good choice. "What do you mean?" "Start by improving your trade dependence on the United Kingdom." Segur said, "Our country can significantly increase its imports of cotton and timber from the US market. This will make you more confident when talking to the British." Tristan hesitated. With all due respect, Your Excellency, France's import volume is already saturated, and you cannot consume so much cotton and wood. You are right. Count Seger nodded solemnly, but in order to support our allies in improving their diplomatic voice, and for our own export, our government will provide special allocations to purchase a large amount of cotton and provide it to you. Tristan was overjoyed. Thank you to our closest allies. So, could you please disclose the size of the special loan? Seger immediately said, at least more than 8 million francs. He had previously received instructions from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. After the British diplomatic protest, he would immediately rush to the United States to discuss cotton procurement. At this time, he was just warming up with Tristan. In advance, Joseph knew that the Bouquet movement would have a heavy blow to cotton production, and he wanted to hoard as much cotton as possible before the market reacted to ensure that the French textile industry had enough raw materials. Even if the textile mills can't use up the cotton, they can still make a profit by reselling it when the price of cotton rises sharply due to the US production. As for investing in American cotton plantations, it is even more profitable. Those plantations that were severely damaged were in danger of bankruptcy, and the plantation owners were willing to sell their shares for only a small investment. This will not only increase France's sources of raw materials, but also drag the United States away from the British market as much as possible. In fact, if France had not provided huge amounts of aid to help the United States found its country, from the economic perspective of the United States, they would have worn the same pants as the British. This is why in history, as soon as the French Revolution broke out, the United States couldn't wait to sever its alliance with France and switch to the embrace of Britain. Logically speaking, as a parliamentary country, the United States should strongly support France in abolishing the royal power and establishing a republic. In fact, everything is determined by the United States market dependence on the United Kingdom. Therefore, it is very important to promote the US trade diversion. This time the United States is dissatisfied with the United Kingdom, which is a rare opportunity. Tristan's face was filled with a smile that couldn't be concealed. I will report this good news to Congress as soon as possible. Long live the Franco-American Alliance. Long live the Franco-American Alliance. Seger responded and smiled. Of course, if your country can provide appropriate concessions, I can also apply for more funds from Archbishop Brian. I promise I will try my best to fight for it from the Trade Commission. Western Caribbean, Jamaica. At dusk, the busy day of Kingston Port had stopped. The black slaves on the dock were driven by the overseers with whips and returned to the slave quarters listlessly. However, on an inconspicuous shoal north of the dock, more than 30 black slaves were still moving wooden boxes from a sloop under the command of 5 or 6 white and mixed race people. Those overseers seemed to be holding whips, but in fact they did not pay attention to the slaves' work at all. Instead, they kept looking around. One of the mixed race people lit the pipe in his hand, took a deep puff, and whispered to the overseer beside him, "The governor has summoned more than 1,000 soldiers last week. Even if we have these guns, we can't be their opponents at all." Yes, the blacks behind him were carrying boxes of brown Bess flintlock rifles, the ones that the Duke of Leeds brought to St. Domingo 2 months ago. The tall middle-aged man beside him said calmly, "There are 300,000 black slaves on this island, and I brought guns. So our soldiers will always be more than the plantation owners." Another white man immediately said, "Major Oriel, those blacks only know how to grow sugarcane. We can't count on them." Yes, there were more than 3,000 people participating in the slave riot the year before last, and it was suppressed by 600 British soldiers in the end. Oriel smiled, then joined the Dignity movement to revolt. Their patrol has more than 400 people. The Dignity movement he mentioned is an abolitionist organization in Jamaica, but most of its members are white. Chapter 620 Palace Fight in Petersburg. The overseer holding the pipe shook his head. The people of the Dignity movement have received military training, but they only care about promoting the prohibition of the transatlantic slave trade, and will never cooperate with black people. I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network, Major Oriel said. If they have a higher goal, they will be willing to unite all forces that can cooperate. Several Overseers looked at him in confusion. Higher goals, yes. Auriel nodded. For example, promoting the independence of Jamaica. How is this possible? The British followed. They will send an expeditionary force when the time comes. Even the people of the dignity movement will never be their opponents. Auriel seemed full of confidence. If it is Jamaica alone, it is of course impossible. But if we can get the support of Saint Domingo and even all the islands in the Caribbean, we can defeat anyone. The white supervisor sighed and said, I still think we should not act so hastily. Those soldiers still need at least 3 months of training. No, Mr. Bryan, please believe me, we will definitely win. The uprising must be launched on the 15th. Seeing that he was so sure, the others did not say anything more pointed. Present, Saint Domingo is the beacon of abolition in the Caribbean. As the representative of Saint Domingo, Auriel's words are absolutely authoritative. Point at most, it will fail again. Anyway, there will be a black slave uprising every few years. Everyone thought so. For the black slaves on the island, perhaps dying in battle is better than being tortured in the plantation all day. However, only Auriel knew that on the 4th of this month, that is, 3 days later, the French expeditionary force would land in Saint Domingue and be defeated by Auger's army on the 9th. Then, inspired by this great victory, black slave uprisings broke out in Jamaica, the Bahamas and the West Indies on the 15th. The black rebels and Saint Domingue will also provide them with reinforcement as appropriate. The entire Caribbean region will be completely burned. Petersburg. In an office of the British Embassy in Russia, Lord Whitworth, the British ambassador to Russia, listened to his subordinates' reports and couldn't help frowning and shaking his head. We must admit that the King of Poland is a huge trouble. He not only has an impact on the Tsar, but now he can even interfere with the actions of the Polish war faction. This is indeed a bit tricky. His assistant Jos looked embarrassed, but the Tsar obviously loves him very much. This time, Poland's establishment of a constitution was explained by him as to facilitate the Tsar's management of Poland, and the Tsar actually accepted this statement. Can we try to get him back to Warsaw? I'm afraid it's not easy. Lord Whitworth recalled what his assistant had just reported about Stanislaus II. They had already placed spies in the Winter Palace and could know in detail the actions of the people around the Tsar. He suddenly thought of something and looked at his assistant. That pretty boy. Oh, Zubov. Why can he tolerate an extra man around the Tsar? Well, your lord, he seems to think that the King of Poland is just a musician and has not challenged his position. Musician? Yes, the Tsar usually just listens to Stanislaus II singing and chatting with him and does not spend the night with him. Lord Whitworth's eyes suddenly lit up. Then let's try to make his lover status more formal. What do you mean? You contact our people in the Winter Palace immediately and ask her to do this. And then, 3 days later, Catherine II leaned back on the recliner with her eyes squinted, listening to her Stasi singing into it comfortably, applauded him to show her appreciation, and then yawned. She turned her head and looked at the clock. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening, so she gestured to the maid standing at the door. Bring my coat. Yes, your majesty. The maid took the mink coat and helped the Tsar put it on. The latter casually said to her maid, Zina, is Platon in the bedroom? As usual, she was going to find the young man to go to bed. The maid hesitated for a moment, but immediately remembered the 5,000 rubles, so she gritted her teeth and bowed her head. Your majesty, General Zubov is not in your bedroom. He said he was a little tired in the afternoon and seemed to have returned to his room to rest. She received a large sum of money from Lord Whitworth a few days ago, and these words were said according to the latter's request. She was not worried about being discovered by the Tsar, because she could completely say General Zubov might have gone to the toilet at that time, so he was not in the bedroom, and I misunderstood. The Tsar would at most scold her a few words, and there would be no danger. Catherine II frowned slightly, lay back in the chair, and signaled to Stanislaus II, Stasi, let's talk for a while. The maid Zina saw this, and hurriedly ordered the maid to burn the fireplace more vigorously, and she quietly lit the incense that had been placed next to her. Stanislaus II then began to speak all kinds of sweet words, occasionally with a few private goods about politics, but Catherine II felt that it was getting hotter and hotter. She took off her outermost layer of clothing and looked at the King of Poland with eyes that gradually became a little blurry. Stanislaw II's heart moved, and he remembered that Zina said that the Tsar was in a good mood today, so he moved closer to her again. Catherine II suddenly reached out and took him into her arms and whispered, "Stassi, hold me tight." Oh, okay. Zina immediately signaled people to retreat. By the time she closed the door, a charming sound could be heard in the room, and the candlelight was beating rhythmically. 11 p.m. Platon Zubov walked anxiously around Catherine II's bedroom, and finally couldn't help but waved to his entourage again. "Go and check the situation again." "Yes, sir." After a while, the follower returned, lowered his head and whispered, "Sir, I heard from the maid that His Majesty is in the old guy's room, and the lights have been turned off." Damn. This. Zubov's face was horribly gloomy. He punched the wall and murmured repeatedly, "No, I have to do something. Do something." His identity, status, and wealth all come from the exclusive favor of Catherine II. Even Potemkin, the Tsar's #1 lover, cannot shake his status in the Tsar's bed. And that damn old Polish man, who used to just sing, now dares to spend the night with His Majesty the Tsar. Suddenly his eyes narrowed. He turned around and returned to his room, where he began to write a letter to Potemkin. A few days later, Potemkin, who was in IRC, frowned when he read the letter from Petersburg. The letter clearly stated, the King of Poland told the Tsar in bed that Poland was willing to send 30,000 troops to assist Prince Potemkin in attacking Silislat. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 621, Eastern European Chess Game. Potemkin tore off the hot towel covering his head and immediately started coughing violently. He had contracted a serious fever in IRC and had not even handled official business in person recently, but at this moment he forced himself to come to the table and picked up the feather pen with trembling hands. As the de facto Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Russia, he saw at a glance what Stanislaw II wanted to do. Poland has been integrating the country in the past 2 years, gradually sorting out the previously chaotic ethnic conflicts and political factions, and promulgated a constitution a few months ago, further strengthening its national strength. If Poland is allowed to continue to develop, it will be difficult for Russia to bite off Poland in at most 5 years, so he has been mobilizing troops since more than half a year ago to prepare for a war against Poland. At this time, the King of Poland instigated the Tsar to use troops against the Ottomans in the south, and Poland even had to send troops to assist. If the Tsar really agreed, then Russia's military focus would be on the Balkan Peninsula for a long time. At the same time, Poland, as an ally who had fought side by side with Russia, made it more difficult for Russia to find an excuse to attack it in the future. This would seriously disrupt Russia's strategic deployment. Of course, Stanislaw II did not have such a powerful political strategy at all. Everything was fabricated by Zubov, who was familiar with Russia's strategic plan. And for Potemkin, in addition to the national issues, he personally hated Stanislaw II. Although he had not slept with Catherine II for a long time, he was always the head of her harem. Any lover of the Tsar had to get his approval before he could take office safely. And this Pole had just sung for the Tsar before, but now he dared to climb into the Tsar's bed without his permission. This was completely challenging his authority and must be punished. More than an hour later, Potemkin finished writing 2 letters with difficulty, handed them to his confidant Popov, and gave them careful instructions. The letter above was written to Zubov, asking him to arrange for a young woman to approach and seduce Stanislaw II, and to design a plan for the Tsar to see the two of them being intimate. It didn't matter if the Pole didn't take the bait, as long as the woman kissed him at the right time, and then claimed to the Tsar that they were in love. With Potemkin and Zubov's control over the Winter Palace, it was not difficult to get the servants around Stanislaw II to confirm this. The other letter was written to General Mikhail Kachowski, ordering him to speed up the preparations for war and to be ready to attack Poland before the end of the Year after Popov left, Potemkin began to cough violently again, and the blood spurting from his nose dyed half of the bedsheet red. Several servants hurried over to support him, but found that he had fainted. Targowica town, eastern Poland. More than a dozen Polish conservative nobles, including Francisco Branicki and Gorzakowski, came out of Count Potocki's manor one after another, all with solemn expressions at the meeting just now. They unanimously agreed to secretly gather the army loyal to them and jointly request Russia to send troops to intervene in the situation in Poland. If it weren't for Joseph's reminder, the Poles would never have thought that it was not the Polish Slavs who betrayed the country and brought the Russian invaders, but these Polish and Lithuanian nobles with pure blood and long family heritage. In fact, they were already dissatisfied from the moment the Polish constitution was promulgated. The new constitution deprived them of their veto power, and political bribery is strictly prohibited. Bribery will be felonies. Bribery could be carried out openly in the past. In order to achieve their political intentions, Russians or Prussians often spend tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of zlotys to buy votes in their hands. With the promulgation of the constitution, they can no longer make this kind of money. In the following period, the Polish parliament successively abolished the privileges of nobles, such as killing serfs, recruiting private soldiers, and levying taxes on trade activities in the territory, on the grounds of violating the principle of harmlessness. So, the angry conservative family, led by Potocki, made the decision to abolish the constitution with the help of Russia. This is a notorious traitorous organization in Polish history, the Targowica Confederation. However, at the suggestion of Joseph, Prince Poniatowski has removed radical clauses in the constitution, such as completely abolishing serfdom and collecting tithes from nobles to strengthen armaments, which made the formation of the Targowica Confederation half a year later than in history. That is to say, Poland has more than half a year of preparation time. When Branicki returned home, he immediately summoned family members and began to prepare for the rebellion. However, just as they secretly recalled their former private cavalry and contacted the local army with close ties, agents of the Freedom and Security Committee arrested 6 core members of the Branicki family. Due to the 1-year-long deployment, the Polish intelligence organization had sufficient evidence. A week later, the 6 people were prosecuted by the Polish prosecutor's office for organizing riots. At the same time, a large number of people from the Targowica alliance, including the Potocki family, the Ankovich family, the Zabio family, and Archbishop Masarski, were purged by the intelligence department. There were more than 70 indictments on the desk of the Polish Supreme Court, and they were busy like ants moving before the rain. Of course, some people in the Targowica alliance acted extremely cautiously, which led to the Freedom and Security Committee being unable to obtain tangible evidence of their crimes. For example, several members of the Rewuski family immediately retreated to their manor in northern Ukraine after the incident, but they have been trying to send people to contact Russia. Half a month later, 3 fanatical believers of the Bar Alliance sneaked into Luski's house, killed all the people named Luski, and then committed suicide by taking poison. At this point, the Targowica alliance, one of Poland's biggest hidden dangers, was basically wiped out. However, one morning, 2 members of the Potocki family were kidnapped by a group of gunmen on their way from a Warsaw prison to the Polish High Court for trial, and their whereabouts are unknown. In the west of Warsaw, in the British Embassy in Poland, Stanislaw Potocki looked at the British ambassador Daniel Jason with a pale face and bowed with fear. "Thank you for your help. Your kindness will be forever remembered by the Potocki family." Jason handed 2 cups of tea to him and his second son respectively, and said with a sad and angry expression, "I cannot sit back and watch a political persecution take place. Your family has inherited great honor, and now you are being charged with a crime imposed by a group of despicable people." Chapter 622 Valentine's Day is coming. It is Britain's established strategic plan to use Poland to align the interests of Prussia and Austria. So after a large number of conservative nobles were recently arrested, Jason immediately realized that these people had great utilization value. So he got in touch with the Prussians in the Polish army. Due to the alliance between Poland and Prussia, Poland has been imitating the Prussian military system, and there are a large number of Prussian officers in the army. Under Jason's instruction, these Prussian officers exchanged the soldiers escorting Potocki, and cooperated with the British spies to complete the prisoner robbery operation. Potocki suddenly gritted his teeth and said, "It must be those guys from the Patriot Party in Poniatowski." In order to control the parliament, they threw all the nobles who did not submit to them into prison. They are committing a crime, is treason. Jason nodded and said with a deep tone, "But these traitors control the parliament and also control the army." "No, there are still troops who are still loyal to traditions and beliefs," Potocki said. "In addition, we are convinced that Russia will not let the order of Poland be destroyed." Jason's heart moved and he quickly asked, "What do you mean by the army?" "We have been in contact with some officers before, and if someone can come forward and call for help, they will definitely respond." "Where's the number of people?" "At least 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers can be mobilized." "It seems there is still hope." A smile flashed in Jason's eyes. "As for the Russian side, I will try to arrange for you to have a secret meeting with His Majesty the Tsar." Paris, dual 7L carriage with smooth lines and luxurious appearance, surrounded by guards, drove along the wooden track towards Notre Dame Cathedral. This is the latest model launched by Gem Carriage Company. It can drive freely on ordinary roads and wooden tracks by switching the wheel mode. Therefore, although the price is as high as more than 3,000 francs, demand still exceeds supply. If you want to get the car within a month, you have to pay a premium of at least 4,000 francs in the compartment of the carriage. Joseph was subconsciously flipping through the report on sugar beet cultivation submitted by the Minister of Agriculture, and he was deep in thought. At present, France has planted more than 1,800 hectares of sugar beets in the area north of Valois, which is already quite large. However, in the past 2 months, there has been almost no increase in the area planted with sugar beets. Vino is still doing his best to promote it, but farmers are still instinctively suspicious of new things. They prefer to grow wheat that can fill their stomachs, and are now more accepting of potatoes. This is only because the government provides tax exemptions and loans from agricultural service consulting companies. Otherwise, it would be difficult to achieve more than 1,800 hectares, and Joseph knew very well that other countries were waiting for the French government to quell the riots, but in fact the French expeditionary force was there to deliver equipment. The Caribbean would soon be overwhelmed by the abolitionist movement and sugar production would fall exponentially. Historically, during the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue, sugarcane production dropped from £80 million to less than £4 million. The Caribbean supplies 85% of Europe's sugar, which means that it won't be long before there will be a sugar shortage in Europe, and the price of sugar will skyrocket. The current 1,800 hectares of sugar beets alone are far from enough to supply France, let alone make money from exports, but he couldn't force French farmers to switch to sugar beets at gunpoint, so Joseph thought of France's largest landowner, the Catholic Church. 10% of all arable land in France belongs to the church. If the church could be persuaded to use part of its land to grow sugar beets, it would be possible to reach the 40,000 to 50,000 hectares he desired. Historically, by the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon had only planted about 28,000 hectares of sugar beets, which could barely meet the sugar demand of the Western European market. However, Napoleon had to compete with the low-cost Caribbean cane sugar at that time, and could only provide high subsidies. Therefore, it only lasted for more than 10 years before it began to significantly reduce the scale of planting. But now, Joseph is sure to make money from beet sugar, so naturally the more he grows, the better. It happened that he also wanted to try out the new carriage he had just picked up, so he drove to Notre Dame de Paris to discuss the matter with Archbishop Beaumont. 40 minutes later, the luxurious silver grey carriage slowly stopped at the edge of the square of Notre Dame de Paris. Joseph looked out of the car window and saw a sea of people in front of the church door. The car could not even squeeze into the square. He turned to look at Emmon. "Is there any big mass today?" Emmon thought for a moment and said, "Your Highness, today seems to be Valentine's Day. These people should be here to grab the first love coupon given by God." Joseph held his forehead. He really forgot that today is February 14th. Speaking of which, he came up with the idea of grabbing the first love coupon for the church, and it was naturally based on the famous grabbing the first incense stick in later generations thanks to the popularity of Catholicism in this era. The effect of his planning was surprisingly good. Point under the promotion that the love of the winner of the first love coupon will be blessed by God. Notre Dame de Paris held this event for the first time last year and earned a full 190,000 francs, among them, the donation made by the lady of the Viscount Deber family to the church, in order to obtain the first love coupon, which was actually an auction, amounted to 45,000 francs. It seems that this year's situation should be more lively than last year. Joseph had no choice but to ask the coachman to go around to the back door of Notre Dame de Paris, and entered Notre Dame through a special passage. The priest who greeted him couldn't help but seemed a little hesitant when he learned that His Royal Highness the Dauphin was going to see Archbishop Beaumont. Joseph immediately understood that Archbishop Beaumont should be presiding over the event of granting the first love coupon at this time, so he said to the priest, "Forget it, don't disturb the Archbishop, I will wait for a while, he will not be so disappointed as to affect others' most profitable business activities of the year." The priest hurriedly bowed to thank him, and Joseph wandered around the Notre Dame. At this time, the crowd was gathered in front of the gate, but the church was very empty. After walking for a while, Joseph felt a little bored, so he sat down on a bench in a prayer room, picked up the Bible and read it like a novel. In the square of Notre Dame de Paris, Archbishop Beaumont stood on the high platform, spread his arms, and recited a prayer, and then loudly said, "Now, let us thank God for his blessing. The Lord spreads true love in the world, and condenses it into a holy one. Love coupons. God will be watching us at this moment, and the most pious person will get the first love ticket, and the blessing of the Lord will fall on him." As soon as he finished speaking, an aristocratic lady wearing a light blue silk dress clasped her hands in prayer and said, "I'm willing to donate 5,000 francs to show my piety." Her voice was immediately suppressed by the girl behind her. "I will donate 7,000 francs. At this moment, a beautiful figure walked out of the crowd and said softly, "Archbishop Beaumont, your devout lamb is willing to donate 40,000 francs. That long golden hair and violet eyes were none other than Camellia." Chapter 623 For Love. The Notre Dame Square in Paris suddenly became quiet. The ladies who were originally planning to bid for the first ticket were stunned. Who is this? It's not playing by the rules. Normally, everyone bids 1 or 2,000, 2 or 3,000 francs, gradually pushing the atmosphere to a climax. In the end, several wealthy ladies who refused to admit defeat competed fiercely, and one of them shouted out an astonishingly high price in a fit of excitement, overwhelming all opponents. At this time, someone directly raised the price by more than 30,000 francs, pushing the price to a terrifying height of 40,000 francs. In the square, everyone stretched their necks to look in the direction of the shouting 40,000 francs. Most people could only see a black and white lace dress, while those who were closer to the front saw the face of the owner of the dress, so beautiful that they forgot to breathe. Seeing that the atmosphere was getting cold, Archbishop Beaumont tried to wink at the priest who was in charge of the bidding. The latter coughed dryly, made the sign of the cross, looked at the crowd and said, "Oh, this lady's piety allows her to bathe in the glory of the Lord. So, who else wants to show her holy faith and soul to God?" Still, no one spoke. In fact, there are still a few noble ladies who can afford 40,000 francs, but they are all hesitant. Camelia's momentum in raising the price just now is obviously that she is determined to win at all costs. If I bid, she is likely to increase the price by another 10,000 or 20,000 francs. At that time, should I follow or not? It is too expensive to follow, and if I don't follow, it will seem that I'm outdone by her. So, it is better to show that I have no intention of bidding and let her go. In fact, Camellia, this fool, has never thought of using any bidding tactics. She just heard that the first love ticket was very effective last year. Miss Deber, who got it, got a marriage proposal from her lover after returning home, and before that, the gentleman didn't seem to be very interested in her, so, in order to make the prince fall in love with her, she decided to buy this love ticket. Yes, she had never participated in any auctions before and just thought she was buying from the church. Based on last year's sale price of more than 40,000 francs, she directly shouted it out. Unexpectedly, it unexpectedly produced a scare effect. The priest who presided over the bidding persuaded in various ways and spoke eloquently for 2 or 3 minutes, but still no one participated in the bid. Archbishop Beaumont's heart was bleeding. He had invested a lot of energy in promoting the Valentine's Day event before and thought that the first love ticket would be sold at a sky-high price, but it turned out to be 5,000 francs lower than last year. The priest on the stage couldn't delay any longer and finally announced loudly that Camelia would be blessed by the Lord. Archbishop Beaumont, with a bitter face, held out a beautifully made love ticket, sprinkled holy water on it, prayed again, and then handed it to Camelia solemnly. After the dust settled on the first love ticket, people flocked to the church gate. There were more than a dozen priests selling love tickets there. Ladies who couldn't get the first ticket could buy a less effective one. The cheapest price was only 5 sous. The one blessed by the archbishop himself was only 3 francs, and the one sprinkled with holy water was 7 francs. Camelia was so excited that her face flushed. Holding the love ticket, she was ready to find a secluded place in the church. According to the church's propaganda, she only needed to write the name of the prince on the ticket, and God would make him fall in love with her. However, as soon as she got out of the crowd and came to the corridor of the church, she met 2 noble ladies. The one on the left wearing a dark pink puffy skirt was the one who had just offered 7,000 francs for the love ticket. The 2 noble ladies stared at Camelia covetously. The latter turned around and tried to walk around them. Unexpectedly, she heard the sarcastic voice of Puffy Skirt. "Ha. It's ridiculous. A wild girl from Austria, who doesn't even have a noble title, actually came to Notre Dame to buy the first love ticket. Don't think we don't know your dirty thoughts. You want to rely on this ticket and God will bless you to be the crown prince. Humph. Dream on." The noble lady next to her had a face full of hatred and said with a pout, "That's right. Even if you get the first love ticket, His Highness will not be able to look down on you and will only think you are disgusting." Camelia immediately lowered her head and wanted to slip away nervously. And seeing her timid puffy skirt became more excited and stretched out his hand to block her. 40,000 francs. Haha, it should be a huge sum of money for you, right? It's a pity to waste it. Let me tell you, only someone of my noble birth can possibly interest His Highness, and I don't need any coupons to help. She was humiliated by Camelia's bid of 40,000 francs today. At least that's what she thought. At the same time, she was also a fan of the crown prince, and she came to compete for the love coupon in order to get His Highness's favor. But there were rumors in the Palace of Versailles that Camelia wanted to become the crown prince's mistress. This made her angry and jealous. How can you do this? Camelia was so anxious that she couldn't speak clearly, and tears kept rolling in her eyes. Puffy Skirt pointed at Camelia and chuckled to the woman next to her. "Look, she really knows how to pretend to be pitiful, as if we bullied her. I guess she also used this trick to seduce His Highness in front of His Highness. TSK, 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 Austrian bitch, put away your ridiculous tears. I'm warning you not to write His Highness's name on this coupon. Do you hear me?" To kept sarcastic. This is also the habit of the aristocrats of the Palace of Versailles. They consider themselves to be of noble birth, and they look down on those without noble titles, especially those from Austria, from the bottom of their hearts. Moreover, this person they looked down on was very beautiful, could get close to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and today he had humiliated them in public. At this time, they just wanted to humiliate her to vent their anger. Camelia just bowed her head and wiped tears in grievance. You go too far." At this moment, Perna, who was holding a 7-franc love coupon in her hand, was walking from the other end of the corridor, but she felt that she heard a familiar voice. She immediately took a few steps back and turned to look at the crowd of more than 10 people watching place. Camelia, when she saw the long, slightly curly golden hair, she couldn't help but frown slightly, and then walked over quickly. "Your Highness has at least hundreds of servants like you, but you are the only one who thinks you can." Puffy Skirt was talking when he saw a tall woman wearing a dark green skirt standing between him and Camellia, even though she was a little angry. Damn it, get out of my way. However, when she saw clearly that the person coming was Perna, she took a half step back nervously. Miss Perna, although Perna was only from a minor aristocracy, she was the rumored chief mistress of the crown prince in the Palace of Versailles. His Highness valued her very much, and even took her with him on the battlefield. Perna glanced at Camellia, who was crying, and said to Skirt in a cold voice, Miss Henriette, what are you doing, Miss Perna? Well, I'm just reminding this guy from a lowly background not to have any wishful thinking about His Highness the Crown Prince. When Perna saw the love coupon held in Camelia's hand, she immediately understood the truth. She had just witnessed the latter's extravagant spending of money. Although Camellia was her rival in love, she couldn't turn a blind eye to this situation. After all, she had experienced in the military camp and had seen big scenes. She immediately turned to Miss Henriette and said coldly, really? Maybe I can help you ask for credit from His Highness and tell him that someone stopped his maid in public today, humiliated her origins, and asked her to stay away from you. I think His Highness the Crown Prince will definitely thank you for your kindness, isn't it? No. Please don't do this. Henriette was shocked and shook his head desperately. I'm not. She raised her eyes to look at Perna, and seeing that she was unmoved, she had to grit her teeth, lowered her head to Camellia and said, I apologize for what I just said, and please forgive me. The maid's tears instantly became more intense. Perna gently stroked her back and said to Henriette, hopefully this won't happen again. After the two aristocratic ladies left in embarrassment, Perna pulled Camellia out of the crowd of onlookers. Seeing that the latter was still crying, she reluctantly turned around and entered the church. She found a prayer room and opened the door. Her attention was all on the maid, and she didn't even see the guards in civilian clothes standing at the door of the prayer room. The guards were familiar with her and Camellia and thought they were invited by the crown prince, so they let them in. Perna asked her love rival to sit down on the bench, wiped her tears with a handkerchief, and comforted her. Don't be sad. They are just jealous of you. You are more beautiful than them, and you also got the first love coupon. Don't talk about those people. In fact, actually, even I'm a little jealous of you. You know, jealousy can make people stupid. Camellia suddenly hugged her slender waist and choked with sobs. Thank you, Miss Perna. If you hadn't appeared, I really don't know what I would have done, she said, then lowered her head. But they are right. I come from a humble background, and I shouldn't have unrealistic thoughts about His Highness. At this moment, a person lying soundly asleep on the bench in the last row of the small prayer room was awakened by their voices. The man took the Bible away from his face and rubbed his sleepy eyes. It was Joseph. Speaking of which, I can't blame him. Reading the Bible was really too hypnotic. In addition, he read the report sent from the Caribbean a little late last night, and he fell asleep just now. He was about to ask the priest if the Valentine's Day event was over, but suddenly he remembered that there was a girl's voice just now. He poked his head out from the back of the bench and saw Perna and Camellia on the bench in the front row, with their backs facing him. Joseph raised his hand to greet the two of them, but heard Perna say, you shouldn't think that way. Everyone has the right to pursue their own love, especially a beautiful and lovely girl like you. Joseph hesitated for a moment, feeling that they would think he was listening in the corner, so he slowly lay back on the bench. Thank you for your comfort. Camellia took a deep breath, as if she had made a lot of determination, and handed the love coupon in her hand to Perna. Miss Perna, I know you also like Wang, Your Highness, and you are the one worthy of him. This love coupon is given to you. I hope it will bring you the love you expect. Perna looked at the expensive love coupon in surprise, pushed it back and said softly, how can I accept this? It's too expensive. Besides, you should stick to your love. I think His Highness will not reject you. Joseph opened his mouth wide. He seemed to have heard something he shouldn't have heard. Camellia was obviously very surprised. But, Miss Perna, don't you blame me for snatching His Highness from you. Snatch? Perna sighed. Your Highness, how can he belong to me alone? She looked at the maid and smiled helplessly. You also know that His Highness's wife can only be a princess. Even if he has me in his heart, I can only be his mistress at most. His Highness is so perfect and full of charm. In fact, as long as I can always be with him, it is already a gift from God. How can I expect to have him alone? Camelia hesitated for a long time, finally raised her head, looked at her, and whispered, "So, I can also. This is your right." Perna nodded. "If his highness likes you, then you should be by his side, take care of him, and bring him happiness and peace of mind. Of course, this doesn't seem fair to you, but we have to endure something for love. You see, in fact, our fate is so similar. We are all attracted by a perfect soul, and are willing to give everything for it." Perna didn't know why she said this to Camelia. Maybe it was because the feelings in her heart had been suppressed for too long, and the latter was the one who could understand this feeling the most. Camelia stood up and knelt down to Perna. "You are really so good. I finally understand why his highness can't leave you." Joseph felt his brain was going to shut down. Are all girls of this era so generous? Even if it happened in the Eastern Empire, there would be at least dozens of episodes of palace fighting, and a lot of musk, aphrodisiacs and the like would be used. You are just talking about these things in such a friendly way. No, it seems that the person they are talking about is me. These little girls are too. Joseph was suddenly stunned. He always subconsciously regarded them as little girls, but in fact, Perna seemed to be 19 years old, and Camelia would soon be 18. And I'm already 17 years old this year, and I will soon be an adult. He subconsciously glanced at the muscles on his arms. Even if he really developed something with them, it seemed normal. Somehow, Joseph suddenly thought, if he had to choose between Perna and Camelia, who should he choose? Both of them are top beauties, with gentle and lovely personalities, and they are very good to me. It's really a difficult problem. Chapter 624 Contracting Agreement. After a long while, a smile finally reappeared on Camelia's face. She took Perna's arm affectionately, and left the small prayer room together. The two had become the most trusted good sisters. Joseph carefully raised his head, and confirmed that the two girls had disappeared. Then he stood up, and thought to himself that it was no wonder that they both asked for leave yesterday. It turned out that they came here to participate in the religious activities on Valentine's Day. He rubbed his numb thighs, and the conversation between the two flashed through his mind. He was quite happy. Perna was gentle and intellectual, Camelia was sweet and lovely, but with his current status, he would definitely not be able to marry any of them. Did he really want them to be his mistresses? Alas, it is still difficult to integrate into the 18th century concept. Forget it, I'd better pretend I don't know. While he was thinking about it, the priest bowed at the door and said, "Your Highness, the ceremony outside is over. Do you want me to invite Archbishop Beaumont?" "Oh, thank you for your hard work." More than 10 minutes later, in the reception room on the second floor of Notre Dame de Paris, Beaumont and several senior priests saluted respectfully to Joseph and smiled. "Your Highness, are you here to participate in the Valentine's Day celebration too?" Joseph thought to himself that I came up with this business plan. Why would I come here to give you money? But he still nodded and said, Yes, this is also an opportunity to be noticed by God. Of course I will not miss it. You are so pious." Beaumont immediately made the sign of the cross and said, "May God bless you." Joseph sat down on the chair and started to talk about business directly. "Archbishop Beaumont, I have a very good business opportunity. I hope to cooperate with the church." Beaumont immediately showed interest and leaned forward. "Your Highness is always thinking about the church. You have the most pious soul in the world." "Oh, what business opportunities do you mean?" "Last time, the Crown Prince instructed the church to sell improved indulgences, which has now become one of the core incomes of the French church. He is looking forward to another similar good business." Joseph smiled and nodded. "Archbishop, you should be familiar with beets, right? This time, the church is also involved in promoting beet planting, and Beaumont naturally needs to understand beets." "Yes, Your Highness, I have planted Mr. Rockard's beets myself." Joseph also leaned forward. "Then have you heard about the situation in the Caribbean?" "You mean the riots of those black people?" "That's right. It can be predicted that it will not be long before Saint Domingo will find it difficult to provide us with enough sugar. Joseph said, and beets will be the most important source of sugar in the future. I hope that the church can help me expand the area of beet cultivation. Beaumont nodded vigorously. Your Highness, the church has indeed been trying to persuade farmers to switch to beets. Joseph, looking at him, he said, no, I mean, use the church's arable land to grow beets. Beaumont was stunned for a moment, then immediately showed an honest smile. Your Highness, you know, the church's expenses have become very large recently for your military academy, mechanical and chemical engineering university, and tax university. If the land income is reduced, I'm afraid you misunderstood. The income from growing beets will be very high. Beaumont shook his head secretly. With the little harvest of beets, the government needs to give a lot of subsidies to farmers who grow beets to barely keep their income on par with that of growing wheat. Just as he was about to show his embarrassment, Joseph immediately said, at present, sugar beets are indeed not profitable, but after the sugarcane production in St. Domingo decreases, the price of sugar will immediately rise sharply. You have to look at the long term. Beaumont said, Your Highness, by then, sugar from Jamaica and the West Indies will pour in, and the price may be. He took a breath and smiled again. Do you think this will work? The church will take out 100 hectares to grow sugar beets. Joseph thought to himself that there would soon be no black slaves available in the sugarcane plantations in Jamaica and the West Indies, so where would the sugarcane flow into France? But this matter involved too much, so he couldn't tell Beaumont. I hope the church can take out 30,000 hectares of arable land to grow sugar beets. Beaumont's eyes were about to pop out. You mean 30,000 hectares? How can this be? Although the income from growing sugar beets is acceptable with subsidies, he is unwilling to put all his hopes on subsidies. Given the financial situation of the French government, it is hard to guarantee that subsidies will not be issued one day. When the time comes to switch to wheat, the farm tools, seeds, sales channels, etc. will have to be tossed around again, and that will cost a lot of money. Joseph persuaded him again, but Beaumont only increased the planting area to 800 hectares and refused to give in. Joseph shook his head helplessly. He really didn't know how to seize the opportunity to make money. He had to say, Archbishop, how about this? I can sign a contract agreement with the church. Ah, what is that? The church will hand over 40,000 hectares of land to the Minister of Agriculture for management, and the government will increase the rent and tax of the tenants by 5% and pay it to the church every year. Of course, the church must assist the government in requiring the annual tribute farmers to plant designated crops. At present, although France has carried out land reform, it does not involve the church. Therefore, the church's land is basically still in the annual tribute farmer model, and the church still has a relatively large influence on the tenants on its own land. Beaumont still looked extremely reluctant. Dealing with tenants is always much easier than dealing with the French government. After all, if the government defaults on the contract fees, it will be very difficult for the church to ask for them. Your Highness, can you give less, such as 5,000 hectares? Joseph's face suddenly darkened. To be honest, the power of the royal family is no longer comparable to when he borrowed grain from the church. The country's politics, economy, military, justice, and propaganda are all in his hands. If it were not for the need for the church to maintain the stability of French society, even if he forcibly confiscated the church's land, these priests would have to obey his orders. Archbishop Beaumont, I have another thing to do today. Joseph suddenly changed his calm tone and said loudly, the St. Domingo Expeditionary Force has just suffered a failure. The General Staff decided to send an additional 8,000 expeditionary forces to the Caribbean. This requires a considerable amount of military expenditure. The church has an unshakable responsibility for the future of France. His Majesty the King needs the church to provide 8 million francs for the expeditionary force. Beaumont was immediately anxious. Your Highness, where does the church get so much money? And the military expenses have never been borne by the church. Joseph pretended to get up and leave. I believe in the financial resources of the church. Please inform other archbishops about this matter. I hope that the money will be received before the expeditionary army sets out. Beaumont's face turned bitter, and he hurriedly stopped Joseph and said, "Your Highness, perhaps we can discuss the contract agreement again." Chapter 625. Please experience the future. An hour later, Joseph walked out of the living room with a relaxed look. Just now, Beaumont has agreed to sign a contracting agreement to hand over 40,000 hectares of church land to the Minister of Agriculture for management. The cost will be increased by 6% on the basis of the current rent and tax for tenant farmers, but the specific land must be selected by the Minister of Agriculture. Although Beaumont cannot command the archbishops of other regions, as long as he thinks it is feasible, other archbishops will basically accept it. Joseph got into the carriage and hurried to Versailles. Spring wheat and spring barley in France are usually sown in March. He must finalize the contract of the church land with Vergnaud as soon as possible and let the farmers switch to sugar beets before they sow. In fact, Joseph also wanted to use this contracting matter to leverage a corner of the church's land. Search TWKAN on Google. If we can continue to control church lands in the form of contracts, we can slowly abolish the sharecropping system on these lands. After it has been implemented for more than 10 years, it has become a customary thing, and the church cannot change it, even if it wants to. Then he found excuses to reduce contracting costs, and finally achieved the goal of recovering the church land. However, the French church has more than 2 million hectares of land in its hands, and it will definitely be a very long process to contract all of it. However, the church's land, and even its assets such as shares and bonds, must be gradually recovered. The church must not be allowed to become a stumbling block on the road to the French Industrial Revolution. It would be best if it could be resolved peacefully, but it is not unacceptable to implement the religious reform as a last resort. It's just that all this can't start until all aspects of French society are more stable. Bavaria. Munich. There was no tinkling sound from the old Berlant iron workshop. Walter Berlant, the owner of the workshop, stood in front of the gate, looking gloomily at the crowds of people across the street. Cheerful music was playing there, and ribbons would float over people's heads from time to time, making it very lively. Berlant knew that the opening celebration of Munich's first Department de France was being held there. Damn the French. Bah. He cursed bitterly and spat hard on the ground. Since a year ago, the area across the street has become a centralized sales center for French caravanseries. Almost every half month, French caravans bring a large number of French goods and set up stalls there for sale. At that time, both nobles and civilians in Munich would flock to the store and sweep away the goods, as if they were free of money. Berlant admitted that those French goods, whether they were ironware, wine, machinery, furniture, cosmetics, paper, etc., were all of high quality and cheap. Even the seller shouts were unique, which greatly stimulated people to spend money. Desire for money. However, once the French caravans began showing up regularly, business in his workshop began to decline. Almost all the farm tools, kitchen utensils, knives, scissors, shelves and other items he makes here are sold by French caravans, and the quality of the iron used in French goods is much better than what he bought from the Bavarian iron factory, and the prices also be cheaper. This resulted in people choosing to wait for the arrival of the French caravan before buying items that were urgently needed. In fact, even Berlant's own home is already filled with all kinds of French goods, French synthetic board furniture, French soaps, and French wine, but his workshop was almost out of business. He just laid off 2 apprentices last week and is barely breaking even. However, something more serious soon arose. The department store de France was built across the street. When he went to Vienna before, he had seen the French department store there. There were neat counters, and behind each counter there were 2 beautiful saleswomen and a male ticket clerk. Behind the glass of the counter are various French products, with prices marked on them. The salesperson will use a nice voice to introduce the product to the customer. After the customer selects what they want to buy, they will package it in exquisite paper boxes. The bill clerk next to you will provide a sales receipt after collecting the money. If there is a problem with the product during the warranty period, the mall will repair it free of charge. Berlant heard that even those beautiful packaging boxes have become collections of Viennese citizens. Every Sunday, there would be a long queue outside that department store, and it would take a long time to get in. Even if the goods are slightly more expensive, people are more willing to buy their. Berland knew that such a mall had appeared across the street from him. In the future, his workshop will be even more unpopular, and he may face bankruptcy. The department store was naturally copied by Joseph according to the model of later generations. He originally planned to build a supermarket, but considering the moral standards of people in this era, he finally chose the shopping mall model. Anyway, workers' wages are low, especially female sales assistants. They can be hired with half the wages of men, so the cost does not increase much. This novel business model originally appeared during the mature period of the Industrial Revolution, that is, around 184x. Joseph made it appear in front of people half a century in advance. Compared to the common single business stores and inconspicuous grocery stores of this era, the French department store is first of all beautifully decorated and spacious. Even if you don't buy anything, it's very nice to come in and stroll around. In the cities of this era, there is really nothing to go to except parks, pubs, and cafes at the same time. The goods in the department store are also very complete, mostly high quality French goods, and some goods from other countries, from luxury goods to daily necessities. And thanks to the low tariffs stipulated by the Rhine-Seine Treaty, the prices of these goods are very affordable. Coupled with the friendly and enthusiastic service attitude of the salesperson and after-sales guarantee, the French department store can quickly occupy the local retail market wherever it appears. In addition, these department stores even have food areas and children's play areas, which are simply unforgettable. In the past year and a half, department stores have basically been built in major cities in the southern German region. The caravans replenished the goods and continuously sold French goods to all parts of Germany. The music on the other side of the street stopped, and after a burst of rapid drum beats, the crowd began to rush into the department store frantically. It was officially open. Brand was staring coldly at the rush to buy through the glass window of the mall when suddenly a carriage stopped beside him. The square-faced man in the carriage leaned out of the window and waved to him. "Walter, go to Wischen Street and gather. The action will start in 1 hour. Oh, remember to bring the scarecrow and the slogan." Brandt nodded vigorously, turned around to greet his 2 sons, picked up the things he had prepared, and rushed to Wischen Street without saying a word. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.